And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight, and the ideas from already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, here I am, rock you like a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight's episode is X Series 200. Wow.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Laptop, you're going to have to shut it off. That is the explosive echo in here. So yeah, you literally just turn it off. Woo, coming to you in supervision. And this is kind of fascinating because whenever we get around the big episodes like X-100, X-200 or whatever, all these things come up around like Maxwell or Epstein. It's just a weird flow somehow, even if we're not covering it at the time. And it's very interesting with all the Epstein stuff that's come up that we have covered Maxwell and Epstein's adventures there in Wonderland. And very interestingly, what's fascinating about all that is we have brought in an angle relating to the whole Belial cult and their obsession with Atlantis that for some reason, I've looked at really good researchers on Epstein and nobody has touched this, which I find really interesting, but also it's a hard thing to go after if you don't know what's going on in the background with them. So there's a lot on the surface riding around. What we're going to do in this episode, which is all about Bobby Inman and the Inman UFO file, which is going to give us a real key insight into how the technology is actually rolled out. But what's going to happen is you're going to find this interesting and very unusual advanced technology piece in the Epstein part. And, so in our own episodes that we've done in the past, where we've looked at things like the kernel in the hot zone, for example, this whole piece that brings you into that very unusual area around the Bahamas comes into play tonight in a very, very unusual way. And it's the intersection of the advanced technology, the kind of ancient investigation, the cult of Belial, and this whole mystery around MJ12 and the real kind of lieutenants of the show in relation to that. And so we're going to do something, of course, in terms of covering Epstein, but it comes in this very unusual way because, there's so much coverage on it. And I don't think you can get any answers that way when there's this flood of things going on. Oddly enough, the key part, in my opinion, is all about what was going on in relation to the scientists. And we're going to bring out some of that tonight, including Marvin Minsky, the father of AI. All going to play out marvelously into this episode where we track it all down through the figure of Admiral Bobby Inman, the former acting director of the CIA, deputy director of the CIA, acting and full director of the NSA, and also assistant director of DIA. I mean, this guy is as deep in the deep state as you could get. And yet, there seems to have been some sort of X-share impulse while he was surrounded by X-protect people. And we're going to find out about that as well as where the technology went when he left those positions so high up in government. And I'm going to reveal something that I don't think a lot of people know about Bobby Inman. And if anyone who's watched this show knows a great deal about Bobby Inman. But we've got some great insights from people who actually know him as well. One of the things that you're not going to realize, maybe if you're just a casual observer of the name Inman when he comes up now and then, is that he actually briefed President Kennedy in the White House in 1961, and also that he became a very key figure for uncovering aspects around JFK's assassination. And that all had to do with the Church Committee questioning him and then the House Assassinations Committee. And that's where this huge crisscross with Joannides comes up. And of course, Joannides, who we've covered so deeply on this program, is finally getting some exposure because one file came out in relation to him changing his name and running this group that was running Oswald. So the first crack in the official wall of secrecy has come through. And it's kind of hilarious because we're seeing all of these things about Joannides and Inman, that picture and everything else. I grabbed that picture out of obscurity about 6 years ago on this show, and we put it in our documentary, which was called UFO File Assassin, the X Protect the UFO File Assassin. And in fact, the cover of that episode of the documentary is the picture of Joannides with Inman. And we did all of the deep background on Inman and Joannides. What's fascinating is now, things like News Nation and stuff, they're just casually throwing it out there like, oh, we just got it, Well, it's interesting, right? It's 10 years late, but it's interesting. And there are a number of things floating around in that soup that I wanted to get to tonight. So I'm going to start off with a couple of them because they're unusual, and they suggest, again, that there are more delays in the UFO hearings that the task force is going to run. That's the Luna Task Force. And now I'm really just calling it the Luna Task Force because Burchett doesn't even seem to be very involved in the day-to-day on that. They've really centered on Luna with it. And it's very interesting. I've been critical of the process because it doesn't go very deep. And I think they've been superficial, and they let people into that process like Chris Mellon and other of these counterintelligence DOD billionaire types. And I think that they've started to realize it now. So all of the UFO hearings got pushed off. First, they were going to happen in May, then in July. Now that's pushed off to September because she has some very interesting explanations about it. But just to see how the X series becomes real life, here we go. That is Chris Cuomo and Anna Luna, and right in the middle is the picture that we brought forward about Joannides. And isn't that amazing?
It's amazing.
So I call it the year dark journalism broke. And
I love
this is it. Fascinating. And I want to say this in relation to Luna. It's not like I expect her to be perfect and know everything and get all this stuff out. And she has been able to get some things out. So I just think that committee and the whole thing, because they're surrounded by people like Elizondo and Mellon and others, they are, there's too many counterintelligence people around them. And so they're getting bad advice and things of that nature. However, I think they deserve credit for looking into it. This is what came out in relation to Luna on this. And here's the question she got asked. You said the public UAP hearings postponed until September. And she says, yeah, we asked multiple people and they weren't willing to testify. Now, they put together all these whistleblowers and they said, oh, we have 44 whistleblowers. We're ready to go. And if this guy goes down, we have this other guy. And they kept doing this. And they had this whole thing going on. Now it turns out, well, the guys couldn't show up because they were sick. And then it was like, well, we got the skiff and then the guys wouldn't show up. What's the point of all this? And so she goes here on the record about why there's the delay to September. And I find it very interesting. Let's see if we can follow along. We asked multiple people and they weren't willing to testify. They said, quote, we either didn't want to be the only one or we were worried about our safety, etc. And this is, part of the background on this. What it is really is that Mellon, who's controlling all those whistleblowers, doesn't want them to get into a skiff because in the skiff, they can get asked real questions. And that creates all, the tantalizing thing of just putting it out there and doing all these tantalizing things, but without really going on the record in a skiff is a pretty big goal of how the CIA UFO threat is operating. You have to keep that in mind. So they're blowing her off. The 44 whistleblowers, they're like, we don't want to do it. And then the question comes up, is any way to create infrastructure where the whistleblowers feel protected? Now, technically, there is whistleblower protection already there. So they're able to go before Congress and have whistleblower protection. And then she said, I think that's going to be more on legislation that we can push. There's still ways people can be messed with, whether it's their clearances, etc. We are going to have a hearing, Luna says, but we're going to bring people in who have firsthand knowledge and or direct evidence, not second or third-hand knowledge. So she's becoming wise to the whole kind of Grush approach of like, this guy told me something, and that's why it's important. So not the third hand, not the second hand. She wants the first hand people. But every time she announces it, they either show up sick, they don't come in, or they say, we're too afraid to do it. So that's where those hearings went. And they've been built up for a good 6 months. They had them, of course, in 2023. We covered them rather extensively. We talked to the whistleblower Grush who came forward and all the rest. But, this process has been so manipulated that you have people like Elizondo, the counterintelligence people, Mellon, and they're around this thing massaging it. And if they can't get it right on their terms, then, those people aren't there. That shows the level of control. And if you have that level of control going on with Chris Mellon and these whistleblowers, forget it. But it gets us back to that UFO secrecy, X protect state of mind. And that's why tonight's episode is so important. This is Dark Journalist X series X-200. And this is the Inman UFO file, CIA Joannides PSYOP revealed. And what's interesting is I've been, kind of on my own with a lot of this, but now the Washington Post is joining in with us saying that, yeah, the Oswald thing was a PSYOP. Well, what do you know? And we're going to get into how the kind of half measures are going to be the order of the day from the national media on this, because there's a certain part that they can't deny anymore, but they're going to try to spin this off, into the whole Cuban mafia thing and avoid the real issue, which is the X protect dogma about eliminating people over the exotic technology on that level. And that's you get the major revolt in relation to that in November of 1963 against the 35th president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Now, what's also interesting, and that's just been kind of floating around as a story, and I found this so peculiar because it involves John Trump, the president's uncle. And of course, we've done so much on John Trump. And looking here on X Series 200, probably the episode that has the most influence in relation to the John Trump story is Tesla Trump and the time capsules, which one we did, I think, 6 years ago or something like that now. And I'm going to go through some of the key episodes that we've done that relate to what's happening now, because so much of the information has been ahead of its time. And this is a crucial factor, which is when you're dealing with very potent kind of journalism, it will be ahead of its time, one, and it won't revert to kind of pop click headlines and clickbait and that kind of thing. It's very crucial in this period where the market on podcasts is being flooded with these pop clickers, and they pick up topics that sound like the X series or something that is potent. It'll sound like Joseph Farrell's work or G.G. Young's work or Bosley or whatever, but it's not. And it is just the glare of the headline of the thing. And then they have this very superficial, kind of pirating of the whole topic. So I want you to be aware of that as we go forward. They are doing it now. They're moving in, they're consolidating, and they are trying to convert the independent media into this very controlled, paid version of the media. It's basically the same forces that have controlled the corporate media from the beginning, and now they're moving very heavily into this independent podcast space. So they want to control that as well, and they're doing a very good job of it. So we have to be aware of that as we also are trying to build an infrastructure. I find the independent media incredibly misleading at this level and incredibly manipulated. So I'm thinking we need a third version of the media coming in on this, and that's the potent side. But check this out. Fact check. Trump tells fictional stories about his uncle and the Unabomber. Now, this is interesting because Trump started musing when he had a visit to Pittsburgh, all about Uncle John again. And of course, Uncle John not only came out of the UFO file with Vannevar Bush as his mentor, which we revealed on this show, but also he was the one who investigated the Tesla papers and all the rest of it. And famously, we did a series of episodes on that. And it was very interesting, the threads that were out there in relation to it. And very early on, I learned the perils of television when I shared all my research with the History Channel, who were, pretending to plan a show on Trump with me. And instead went off and made this terrible thing, this warped version of what we did. And they called it the Tesla Files. And they had these, kind of bobble-headed people running around and doing all this nonsense, pretending they had just discovered things that I had talked about them for hours with on the phone. And, they did the kind of human vacuum cleaner thing with my brain. But so what I learned from that, and it's very interesting because what you get though, if you really track down John Trump, is he is connected to that higher echelon of understanding. He's in on the secrecy matters around the UFO file. After all, it was Vannevar Bush who ran the UFO file. So Trump inherits that, and I feel that there's a certain amount of steganography going on when Trump is relating his experiences with Uncle John. But anyway, he starts talking about how Uncle John had Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as one of his students. So, correctly, the mainstream media went into this, and it wasn't true. It's a very odd thing for him to say. President Donald Trump likes to boast about the brilliance of his late uncle, John Trump, who spent decades as a professor of electrical engineering at MIT, about 10 minutes from here. And when speaking about all manners of subjects, the president likes to make up stories. So, they're doing a hit job on Trump, but it is interesting nonetheless. On Tuesday, Trump conjured an especially odd imaginary tale that linked his uncle with the late terrorist Theodore Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. Trump was speaking at a Pennsylvania event about energy and innovation when he said he had to brag for just a second about his uncle's intelligence. After saying his uncle was the longest serving professor in the history of MIT and saying his uncle's 3 university degrees were nuclear, chemical, and math, he said Kaczynski was one of his students. He went on to tell a story about having asked his uncle about the Unabomber and what he was like. I said, "What kind of a student was Kaczynski, Uncle John?" Dr. John Trump. I said, "What kind of a student?" And then he said, "Seriously good." He said he'd go around correcting everybody, but it didn't work out too well for him. Huh. Now this is interesting. For 2 big reasons, this story could not be accurate. First, the president's uncle died in 1985. That's right after Reagan gave him a Career Achievement Medal in Science. And that's interesting too, because the year before he had gotten the same medal in England. Level that Uncle John was on is just phenomenal, over the top. And Kaczynski was publicly revealed as the Unabomber more than a decade later in 1996 when he was captured. Before that, he'd lived as a recluse in the Montana wilderness. There's no apparent reason that Trump would have been asking anyone about Kaczynski in 1985 or earlier. Second, Kaczynski attended Harvard and the University of Michigan, not MIT. An MIT spokesperson said in the Wednesday email, "We have no enrollment record or information about Ted Kaczynski ever attending." Isn't this fascinating? So obviously, in my opinion, because of this wave of strange Epstein things and how all of these different forces were trying to somehow put the Epstein cover up on Trump, and that he had stumbled in some of his responses to it. But it was very unusual because I felt like this was him saying in return, "Here's a little something for you. How about if I reveal the real story of the Unabomber?" So there was a lot of steganography right in the heart of that. And also, of course, again, the Uncle John mentioned right in the middle of the whole thing. So we were looking at something that I think, you've got this esteemed professor, Uncle John Trump, and then here is Trump talking about the Unabomber for some reason, and the dates are wrong, etc. So the article gets that right, but the question is, what's it all about, Alfie? Right? What's it all about? Very, very strange. Whenever you get into this area that we're in, the last thing I'm going to say in relation to the current scandal part around all of this reporting on the Epstein side, when so much of it has been solidly covered up for 15 years or whatever. Well, this is interesting because I believe if you go and look at that record just a little bit, that you're going to see in the last month before that, when Elon was having the big blowout fight with Trump, something very strange was going on. Elon was implicating Trump in relation to Epstein over and over again and really making wild charges. After supporting him, helping him get into the presidency and everything else, he went crazy on him, right? He said, "Oh, the reason you won't release the files is because you're in them," and all the rest. And Trump hadn't said anything about releasing them at that point. So that tells you a great deal about what came up here in relation to all this and how it was somehow going to be used as a cudgel against the Trump administration. And yet, of course, as we know, it's President Clinton who had all the visits to Lolita Island with Epstein. So that whole thing is a huge political backstory, and it involves, the elite pimp idea. It involves the spying and all these other people. What's missed in that story, and it's going to come out tonight, oddly enough, because we're talking about advanced technology, is the aspect around the advanced technology piece underwater. And we're going to get into that tonight as well. What is fascinating for me, though, is I want everyone to pay attention to the fact that it was Elon who went after Trump with this first. Then Elon said, I have this party. It's going to be the America Party, and I've been talking for a long time about Elon Musk. Of course, this is the X-Steganography series. We went into how X was going to be rolled out on this level long time before he bought Twitter and created this whole X thing and the Everything app and all that stuff. Of course, he had, SpaceX. He had this relationship with X, and the whole title. This is part of the Steganography piece because he's the one who's there to roll out the extended X steganography, the technology and everything else that has to go with it. Now, here's what's interesting to me. They all, as I've pointed out, like Bezos and others, have the X steganography embedded. That's why this is the X steganography series. So what Elon's goal in order to dominate space and all these other things that they set him up to do through DARPA and other places is to be basically space president. And the America Party is the leg to do that because, of course, you can't, if you're from South Africa, be president here. So there's something very unusual with that. Now, when I see people going far out and going super anti-Trump after they helped elect him, and I'm not talking about traditional criticism. That's absolutely fine. And very often Trump strolls right into that. But something else is going on in relation to this. And I think that figures that represent this Musk America Party are going behind the scenes to people like Tucker Carlson and saying, you can be the candidate for the America Party. This is your moment. And, appealing to their sense of patriotism. You can change the country and all this stuff. But I think behind that is the, kind of hollow smile smirk of Elon Musk. And that's what I wanted to put on the record in relation to all that stuff that's come up. We're going to be hearing so much more as things come out, but keep that all in mind. And I guarantee you, there is no way that Elon Musk wasn't behind this aspect of it being pushed at this particular point in order to help him launch this independent America Party thing. And by the way, I think America certainly deserves a good, solid third party and always has. And the Democrats and the Republicans forget it. And yet, I don't want it to come through that kind of DARPA high-tech, machine, the digital ID wing of the whole thing. I want it to be a kind of a much more from the bottom up type movement. So we have to be very careful about what people dance into, I would say, in relation to that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 200, the Inman UFO file, CIA, Joannides, PSYOP revealed. Well, we've put Joannides on the map in a number of ways, and there's a reason for that. And we're going to get into just how important that breakthrough is. But if it's not connected with Inman and his role deep in these programs, then it's not going to make any headway, and people aren't going to understand what it is. And tonight we're going to explain to you. We're also, I'm going to remind you before we go any further that we're going to take your questions in the second part of tonight's program. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I got Happy Hermit 3D says, congrats on X-200, big milestone, epic body of work. And Song of Prayer says, DJ, getting more and more coverage is one of the best possible things for the world. I do not say that lightly. So happy this work is having an ever greater reach. Blessings to Daniel and Olivia.
Wow.
And Jessica Rodriguez says, you, DJ, are the potent media.
Excellent. I like that, potent media. That's what we want. See, that's what we should deliver. And everyone in the ideas room has that. See, we have that kind of simpatico thing going on. And it's really true that so many things ripple out from the shows that we do, and that is the ideas from in that kind of crisscross, the chemistry of the ideas coming along that way. And that's the power of what a group can do, with these things. Garrison used to say, one man armed with the truth constitutes a majority. And that's how I like to think about this show, even at times if we have to be a lone outpost, as I say. And I say that dramatically, of course. Speaking of that, though, I wanted to mention this because, of course, recently we got this shout out from Robbie Williams, and somebody pointed it out to me. It was on Sean Atwood, and I've been on Sean Atwood. I enjoy his shows, and he did a great. We did a great series of interviews together, and but that was over a year ago. But Robbie Williams went on his show, and he quoted, "I like the Dark Journalist. Listening to it blew my mind." And he went into how he enjoyed the Mystery School episodes and Rudolph
Everybody
Steiner.
cites the mystery schools.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. And I'll tell you, Robbie has had such interesting experiences on the UFO side in his own life. So I put it out there that if he ever wants to come on this show, Robbie, I know you're a viewer out there. We would love to have you on here. And anytime you just name it. And we're all big fans of yours here as well. So, and thank you so much for that. I think it wouldn't that be fantastic? What kind of a great show would that be?
Legendary.
Incredible. Someone asked me, because it was coming up to X-200, to put together the episodes, my top list. And I'm going to put that up on X Twitter, or I'll put it in the community section on the YouTube channel. But I'm going to point out a couple here tonight because they concern how we get to tonight's episode. One of them, which I've pointed out before, is from last fall, and it was right getting into the fall, and it was kind of overshadowed by all the Trump assassination stuff and all the things that were going on. And by the way, we just crossed the Rubicon of that anniversary. There's still no answer around Thomas Matthew Crooks. There's still no answers around the second one. Very, very unusual. And we still don't know if that was Crooks on top of that building. They cremated him so fast. There are deep, deep investigations that need to happen. And I think the kerfuffle with the FBI and all that, I'm not sensing from the people that have been put in FBI leadership that they are particularly concerned with getting to the bottom on those things. I think they have a lot to deal with as it is. And I also think they're extreme outsiders on a lot of this. And so I always say these guys have a Stansfield Turner problem. And Turner was the CIA director that Jimmy Carter plopped in there after the CIA had all these scandals. And he was a friend of, Carter's from military college or something. And he didn't have the connection. So he got in there, and the CIA, they acknowledged him as the leader, but they just didn't share anything with him. So you have to be careful. There's a way to really bring these agencies into some kind of balance with the U.S. Constitution, and it can be a little tricky situation when they first get in. So, I've said that you really need to give this administration about a year of being in there to really understand what they're doing. So a lot of the criticism and things that they've picked up on, I don't think is warranted yet. But some of the missteps, I think, can be cleared up pretty easily. And overall, I think it's a great team. People like Gabbard, Kennedy, and stuff. And so when I see that kind of pop click independent media thing going after them, I'm very concerned about who is behind that. You remember that thing where they were saying, "Oh, we've got blackmail on Robert Kennedy, and he's been blackmailed."
Oh God!
And everyone was doing that, and they said, "Oh yeah, we're going to present it like later today or whatever," and it just went away. Right? They didn't do anything. They didn't have anything. And we all know who those channels were. I'm not even going to mention them, but this is the kind of thing to be careful of, which is somebody's agenda is being served by putting that out there, and then they just scuttle away into the background, and they never get called out on it, except from people who actually know what journalism is. So here's a couple of episodes that you must see before we break into tonight's episode. This one is Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, and it contains information about a very important aspect between Pope and Castro on ancient discoveries off the coast of Cuba. And there's a mafia overlay there, which is quite fascinating. But the whole thing is incredible. It's from last fall, and it's just available on this channel for free. Hacking Atlantis. We're going to get into some of this tonight as well, because this is the craze in the hot zone. It is so many of these figures: T.T. Brown, Rudolf Steiner, Paulina Zalitsky, and so many of the things around Cuba, oddly enough. And we're going to find that the mystery schools were involved there, but very unusual characters like the Colonel, the Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel, and his daughter, who was the lead investigator on ancient civilization and had incredible connections, including being best friends with Albert Einstein and someone else who comes up tonight, Marvin Minsky, the father of AI. Well, that's a very interesting relationship indeed. Pyramid X is the documentary we just put out in May. This has gotten a phenomenal response, and this is incredible. It really goes deep on what they're finding now through those space scans beneath the Giza Plateau. And as Edgar Cayce predicted, there is an incredible expanse there of a Hall of Records pyramid. Remember, that's Pyramid X. Cayce said, it's the Atlantean pyramid underground. It's a pyramid under there. So this is a crucial thing, because very often we think Hall of Records, we're looking for a structure, a temple or something. Well, this is a pyramid. It's very important to keep that in mind. And I think that Pyramid X holds, it's the best production team thing that we've had, and that's an award-winning production team. We did it with Kelsey Forrest, who did an incredible job with it. But the whole thing, was just fantastic. And that's something that I've made available, and it's our latest documentary, and it's part of a mini series that we're doing. That's all available on this channel, so keep that in mind. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us basically getting around the incredible wall of censorship that Google's put up around anything that we do. And basically, you'll just get an email once a week about the incredible shows that we have coming up for you. Documentaries, incredible guests, top guests. We just recently did an interview with Walter Bosley on NIMSA. And this was an extraordinary episode. And, we have all that coming up for you. X-series episodes that'll blow your mind, and events, the whole thing. It's all there in the newsletter. So stand up and be counted. Get around the censorship. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Jessica Rodriguez says, so has the file officially been released? I know the Joannides files haven't been released. Those are still classified after all this time and are connected to the UFO and JFK files. And Legal Alien says, did DJ send a letter to
Yes, on the second one. And, Congress is very aware. I have a 198-page binder for them that could basically merge their JFK investigation with the UFO investigation. That should be one. The task force should be doing both of those as one thing, because if you want to get to the bottom of the Kennedy thing, you're going to have to go through the UFO file to do it. And that's become more and more obvious. And, our work has been the leading edge on that. But now there are people who've come forward, and some on their deathbeds, who've said, who were bona fide members of Kennedy's national security team, and talked in depth about how the UFO file was a regular part of the procedure in the Kennedy administration. And that, Kennedy went out to White Sands for one particular incident where a UFO came down during a nuclear test. So there's a great deal there. We've put Douglas Caddy on the record, the Watergate lawyer, everything in relation to that. So what you want to do is get out of this siloed thing that they're doing with the task force. That UAP thing, the Robert Kennedy assassination and the JFK assassination, it's all one big thing. And that's how you need to go at it. And you can go at it by questioning people who have knowledge of that from a few different levels. And one of those figures is Admiral Bobby Inman. I want to get into that tonight, including the facts that I started the show off with, which is Inman briefed President Kennedy. Now, I don't think a lot of people have ever heard that before, but it's in the record. And that's something I'm going to bring forward tonight as well. The other thing is that the church committee in closed session brought Inman forward. I don't think that's been on the record either. And the House Assassinations Committee in closed session brought Inman forward. And there are startling things that Inman put on the record about what the Defense Secretary Schlesinger at the time in the 1970s told him and showed him in relation to this. I'm going to read his transcript in relation to that. And it's very interesting because it's pretty easy to miss because he's the head chair at Caltech. And they did one of these, here's a time capsule version of your bio for eternity. And they went through everything with him. And very interestingly placed in there among the key biographical points of Inman, who has had a very distinguished career on a number of levels. But very, very interestingly and unusually is this odd piece of him having to testify about the JFK assassination during the 1970s, because, of course, he was active throughout the military during the Kennedy period. So that, when we get later to understanding Joannides and why Inman is giving him the medal, et cetera, which I said now the Washington Post is even talking about this. I mean, this is incredible, right? It went from this very obscure thing that we were pointing out to now they have to report on it because it's an established fact. This is the power that you can bring forward with a committee. And the problem is the committee has all kinds of power to bring real transparency in the JFK case and around the UFO file. Unfortunately, they've frittered away most of that, but they have the records release aspect. And if they can do the hearings on the record release, then you're getting somewhere in relation to it. And I want to say this before I get into certain aspects around Inman. And like I said, Inman, he has walked that very interesting line in his career as somebody who believed in the secrecy and thought for the sake of the United States that we really needed that, but also seemed very against the clandestine CIA handling of things, and at times suspicious of CIA, even though he was the acting director and deputy director. I'm also going to talk about the incredible controversy of when he was appointed defense secretary by Clinton and how he got pushed out, including with the most hardcore rumors about his personal life and all these things that they were doing. The team that was on top of getting him out of mission was very, very formidable. And that's a definite deep state hit. Odd, very odd for someone who's part of MJ-12. So we're seeing dueling factions there. The crucial thing when you get into Bobby Inman is to understand he's at the heart of the advanced exotic technology question. And on the record, he's already associated with the UFO file in his own words to various journalists. And I'm going to bring forward 4 tonight. One of the things that I can say is personally from my conversations with John Warner IV, that the role of Inman is not very well understood in history. And he certainly, just like John's dad, was a member of MJ-12. As a matter of fact, Eric Walker, who's a Black Project scientist, went on the record saying that Inman was MJ-4, which makes total sense to me and doesn't require any great leaps in logic on that, because he was somebody who knew how to keep secrets. The thing is, and why I think he's an interesting character, that he walks between the worlds of X-Protect and X-Share, is that there have been times out and out when that establishment seems to have chased him out. And he, if I were to take him biographically after he rises and has this incredible rise to all these different positions, including admiral and NSA director and deputy director of the CIA, and even the Fed chair of the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. I mean, yeah, this guy is connected as connected gets. But you can see that there's a possibility here where this congressional committee has a moment because of Joannides, and this is an incredible it's like a window in eternity where you can grab the moment for history's sake. Joannides is this key figure who it's now exposed was the architect of the Oswald project. They haven't even exposed the extent of the crimes that he's committed. Somebody asked me about, in the questions there just now, they asked about, have Inman's files been released? Well, look, Inman was the CIA director, acting director. He was NSA director. They're not going to release anything about him. He's not technically related to these things. And they have, he's not somebody who's in those files. He's not part of the declassification process. What's crucial about Inman and why he should be brought forward before the task force committee that Luna is running is that he represents that interface between the JFK assassination and the secrecy of the UFO UAP world. That piece is so crucial, and you don't have anyone that is so identifiably connected to both. So what you have is the exposure of Joannides, opening up that the CIA was tracking the patsy assassin, Oswald, and they were moving in the situation to put him into position, and that they hired a group to actually spread rumors about him and Castro. So they were hiring this DRE group in New Orleans to pit themselves against Oswald. And Oswald was working for the former head of the UFO file, Guy Bannister. So all of those aspects are in play. You're there. You're right in the heart of it. But now the record is out, just the one key record. And like I said, there's so much more that is not on the record. But we've got this one key piece. And I'm going to read a quick section of the article because it's extraordinary, even that the Washington Post now, what they're going to try to do, since they realize the secrecy wall has collapsed at some level with this, is they're going to try to make it into a Cuban mafia thing that, the government was just being noble by avoiding war. We're going to get into that. And I wanted to mention for you UFO files out there that very interesting character shows up in the middle of all this, and that is John Alexander, Colonel, who is a colorful character in all of this. So that's going to be exciting. What do you got there?
Colorful? I'd say dark. So Thomas Ball says Inman had a very special skill set, microelectronics, satellites, signals processing, and woo. And Jessica Rodriguez says, I wonder what classification level Inman has.
Oh, I mean, it was as high as you could get. But if you're on the MJ committees, if he's MJ4 in relation to the UFO file, he was a person who could keep secrets. He had proved it. And he was interestingly coached by Director Schlesinger in the 70s about how to respond to the church committee. And there's something that he put on the record in his Caltech transcript that is absolutely befuddling that it's out there in public. And just wait till I read it tonight, because this isn't going to make any sense.
Don't make us wait.
This isn't going to make any sense at all. No, we're going to do the article first.
Okay.
So I've pointed this out. This is a crucial part of the files that came out in relation to Joannides. This is Bobby Ray Inman, the acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency, on March 15th, 1981, recommending Joannides be awarded the Career Intelligence Medal. And he says, it's recommended that Joannides be awarded this Career Intelligence Medal for his more than 28 years of devoted and effective service to the agency. Mr. Joannides was born in 1922 in Athens, Greece, and emigrated to New York City in 1923 with his family. And they go on and on. And it's very interesting. They had him operating out of Athens for a good while as part of that CIA group there. And it's very interesting that we had an assassins group that worked right outside of Athens. So keep that in mind as we go. Now, from the Washington Post article, are you ready? The Washington Post agrees with dark journalists. What is going on in the world? The documents also show that the CIA gave Joannides a Career Commendation Medal in 1981 as part of his handling of the Cuban group, and also for his role as a liaison to the House Assassinations Committee. Note, the medal, he's being given a medal for one, creating the Oswald project by having the DRE paint Oswald as a crazed communist and all the rest, as they did, and they ran ads against Oswald before the assassination. Now think about this also. They're also the ones who, had the big fight with him and how they got on, Oswald got on television in New Orleans and then came as part of that television group, and gave all these statements about being a Marxist and all the rest of it, because he was pretending to be part of Fair Play for Cuba committee while working for right-wing Guy Bannister. Very interestingly, the minute the assassination happens, the networks have this shot of Oswald talking about being a Marxist and all the rest of it from that New Orleans TV conversation.
Terribly convenient.
Very, very convenient. So what happens is in here, they're saying, oh, we're also giving him the medal for being the liaison to the House Assassinations Committee. Now, researchers have said that Joannides stonewalled them when they dug deeper into the CIA files. Now, it's been revealed that Joannides, when he was giving this information out and working with the committee, which was getting too close, and what they did is they got rid of Stokes and some of the other leadership of the committee, and they installed these other guys who were all about, hey, look into a mafia connection, this kind of thing, which is very lightweight, lukewarm aspect of this, the way to get it off the government and onto these low-level mafia figures. One of the most interesting ones they called before the committee was Santos Trafficante. And, it is interesting because Trafficante was known from his activities from Miami to Cuba to do all these favors for the Central Intelligence Agency. And when he gets before that committee, he just takes the fifth for the entire thing and nothing happens to him. But I think that is particularly interesting because Joannides was operating the CIA Miami station. He was the top psychological warfare officer in North America. So, we have to understand the crucial aspect of what Joannides is, and then that he's being given a medal for blocking inquiries into the CIA role in the JFK assassination. That's why he gets the Career Achievement Medal, and it is Bobby Inman recommending the medal to. So that goes to Bobby Inman, who was the acting director, and that gives, now that the Joannides records have broke, and we have, Luna out there saying, well, this is a major thing that shows the CIA had involvement in the JFK assassination, setting up the patsy. Well, what you would do if you're a responsible committee is you take Inman and you say, we want you before the committee to answer questions about why Joannides got a medal for blocking JFK researchers then. And, and again, it's not saying that Inman is guilty in relation to the Kennedy assassination, but he's participating and rewarding the cover-up artist. So he has a lot that he can put on the record just in relation to that. But when we go and extrapolate it out and we see the things that Inman is involved with on the exotic technology UFO file side, then he has a lot that he can offer this committee that's looking into both after all. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The commendation noted his assignment as chief of psychological warfare branch in Miami in 1962 and said he did particularly well with the handling of the exile student group. That's the DRE. Now, Washington Post, that's the article from the Washington Post. That's a summary. Here's the headline. The CIA reveals more of its connections to Lee Harvey Oswald. You understand how we're in a different field now. Before, the longstanding thing was they didn't know anything about him. He was some, lone weirdo who worked. He was a communist who dreamed about killing a president. And hey, it just worked out that he got a job on the presidential motorcade 6 weeks before the president got there and no one even knew he was coming. Interesting things like that in history. That's the official version of what happened. And that he took a terrible gun up there and got the greatest shot that all these other, rifle marksmen couldn't do. And also he managed to shoot Kennedy from the front, even though he was behind him in a building. Isn't that extraordinary? Mm-hmm. It's magic. So all of those pieces are gone now because even the Washington Post has to refer to the fact that it's on the record that the CIA has done this, flim-flam in relation to who Oswald was and what their knowledge was of him. In fact, they were tracking him from 1959 to 1963. Professor Scott, who has put so much on the record about the deep state and the Kennedy assassination, and The Deep State and the Death of JFK is a phenomenal book. One of the things that he put out there is this concept of the designated culprit. We need to keep this in mind also when we have big things going on now, like you are getting this thing about Epstein, Trump, and all this stuff. Very careful about the designated culprit. Now, the designated culprit is somebody who, before the deep event happens, like in the case of the 19 hijackers of 9/11, you have to get the agencies, the federal agencies, off their backs because you don't want to interfere with how you're going to set them up. And you will find that in October, the Secret Service took Oswald off of their, kind of watch list. The FBI took him off the watch list. Everybody's pulling back on Oswald just before the assassination takes place so that he can be sure that he's going to be there in that building and they can set him up. This is a crucial understanding and a crucial aspect to see how an operation like this works. New documents show an officer known only as Howard managed a Cuban group that interacted with Oswald in the months before the JFK assassination. They've had to admit now, because of the file release, that Joannides was manipulating Oswald through the DRE there in New Orleans in the summer before the assassination. And then as soon as Oswald is picked up in the assassination, they start running ads with Joannides money saying, oh, he's Castro's best friend. He did it. New documents unearthed by the House Task Force prove the revelation that adds fuels to the long simmering question around the agency and around the plot to murder the president and what else the CIA may be hiding. The documents confirm that George Joannides, a CIA officer based in Miami in 1963, was helping finance and oversee a group of Cuban students opposed to the ascension of Fidel Castro. Joannides had a covert assignment to manage anti-Castro propaganda and disrupt pro-Castro groups, even as the CIA was prohibited from domestic spying. They were doing it anyway. The CIA-backed group known as the DRE was aware of Oswald as he publicly promoted a pro-Castro policy in the U.S., and its members physically clashed with him the 3 months before the assassination. DRE member said Oswald approached them and offered his help, possibly to work as a mole within his pro-Castro group, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And this is an interesting thing that I believe that Bannister had him do, which is infiltrate all the groups, right, left, and center, because I think Bannister wanted that kind of intel. And it goes on, the House Oversight Committee created a task force on federal secrets to revisit the executive orders of President Trump. And Chairwoman Luna from Florida had a push for the CIA to revisit its archives, which produced some significant discoveries, including new details about Joannides, who had previously been identified with the alias of Howard. And it was Howard who was paying off these various groups in Miami to agitate in New Orleans. Now, it's very interesting as well because there's a piece in here which is a suggestion from a higher CIA official that the Department of Motor Vehicles needs to give this guy a license and that, they can't question it. Here's what it needs to say and all the rest of it. So they're setting up his phony ID and, they're calling him a lawyer and all these other things. Now, the people around the task force are saying there's more to come. This is where it gets tricky because the more to come piece means that they have to find a way to spin the Joannides part into, the mafia was involved. This is what they're heading up to. Anti-Castro Cuban and mafia assassinated President Kennedy. And that's what they were covering up, but they were doing it to avoid World War III, all of that, right? And so what that is intended to do is seemingly put the CIA on the hook, but actually get them off the hook. It's a marvelous piece. Now, Joannides, when Inman gives him the award, has just succeeded in shutting down the House Assassination Committee inquiry after 3 years into the president's murder. So he gets the medal there from Inman. And Inman recommended it. They're saying there on record, it's for blocking the JFK inquiry and working with the House Assassinations Committee, and also for his work with the DRE, who set up Oswald. So what they're rewarding him for are, basically the two things that he did in a criminal faction. Now, it's interesting to note that the agreement between the committee and the Central Intelligence Agency was that they would not have anyone who was active in 1963 as an agent working with their committee in 1979. And the CIA said, that's no problem. Here's this guy, Joannides. He wasn't doing anything in 1963. Well, that was a lie. He was the top psychological warfare officer. So the fact that they rolled him out there and had him deflecting in the case of the CIA is the same thing as putting Alan Dawes on the Warren Commission. So now all of that needs to be thrown out. The entire history of that needs to be thrown out. But the way it's thrown out is important. And I'm going to get into that next, because you have to do it in the right way, and you have to find out why space and the advanced technology is at the very heart of what these people were involved with. Or else you're going to get stuck with, some wise guys from the 1960s and saying, oh, they wanted a gambling casino in Cuba and they decided to kill Kennedy because they couldn't get it. That's what you'll end up with. That's the outcome we don't want. So keep that in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 200, the Inman UFO file, CIA, Joannides PSYOP. How deep does this go? Well, it doesn't get any deeper, but it's the X-Series after all. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And I will say also that, you can ask those questions now. Miss Olivia's taking them. What do you got over there?
He said Death Star community says Joannides could be single-handedly responsible for the creepification of America. Andrew Franklin says Joannides died in Houston, where the Del Shao work was found. And Roger Z says Houston, Texas is the most Aramonic city we have in America.
Wow. Listen, there's so many wonderful people from Houston. I can't accept that. And, Houston's a great town. It's just very interesting because the power that circulates in Texas and its main centers from Houston to Dallas to Austin, watch out. That is a power base. And it is very often very hard to know exactly who is controlling that. And there were factions there that, were just leading big oil factions. But then it became the heart of aerospace. It became the heart of military secrecy, and so on. So it is an incredibly potent location, regardless of how you look at it. But there's a lot of Texas that comes into what we've been doing with Roswell Reignited, which is a very exciting series that we're running and doing episodes on right here inside of the X series. The Roswell Reignited piece is going to open up the connections between Texas and Roswell in relation to the UFO crash that took place there in 1947, and how the JFK assassination figures 16 years later, that figures in the JFK assassination, including the policeman who picked up Oswald's rifle, ended up working for and running everything for the people who owned the Roswell Ranch, who were the Fosters, who became very big oil people after they sold that ranch to the government. That is a huge, and I mean a huge game changer in the field around Roswell and those realizations. And we also have a very extraordinary whistleblower named Dorothy, who's given me facts that just aren't on the record anywhere. And as I dug into them, the whole thing opened. So this is an extraordinary piece. We're working right now with her on ways, because she has a very significant position. We're working on ways to keep her very anonymous, to present her anonymously. And thank God the technology is there to do that. But we're still setting that up. And Dorothy apparently is going to come forward and tell us more on that in relation to Eugene Boone, who is the policeman who found the Oswald rifle, identified it as a Mauser inside of the Texas School Book Depository, and then magically shows up a couple of years later running all of the Foster ranch business. And there is a very unusual piece of that, which is the children's homes that he is running for the Fosters, which are, these Christian children's homes that have a great reputation of placing children and all the rest of it. But oddly enough, a very strange characteristic comes out of those homes as well, which is apparently there are alien abductions that take place there. So we're in tricky territory getting into that story. I highly recommend
Mhm.
you keep track with our Roswell Reignited series. And very recently, we were lucky enough to have Joseph Farrell and Walter Bosley in their respective interviews comment and give us kind of live input on that. And it is very, very interesting. Yeah, what do you got?
Jack Trading says, like most of these deep state crooks, Inman, after he retired, went to work for the military industrial complex, MITRE Corporation. And Joseph again says, not to mention that Inman went to work for SAIC. Talk about off the books technology.
Well, that's very interesting. And I actually track it back to the fact that he was working for the secret version of the NRO that was dealing with underwater investigation. That was a very interesting track that he was on, and he eventually became the leader of. You know who else led that?
Who?
John Warner, Senator Warner, who is John Warner the Fourth's dad, been on this program, who was also the head of the Navy. But this piece around that secretive group that's exploring things underwater and how that relates to Inman and the UFO file becomes extraordinary. Read a couple of things about Inman, and we have to track his career in very unusual, very interesting glints. One of the pieces I want to mention about him is I want to get his own, what he says on the record about briefing President Kennedy. I think this is significant. It has never been brought out. I found it, as I said, in this kind of Caltech history thing that he gave out. It's not anywhere else. And I think it's extraordinary and gives us a much better bird's eye view of what was going on in Inman's mind about Kennedy and the assassination piece. Very unusual that someone who understood the assassination on the level that he did is giving Joannides the career intelligence there. And what kind of instructions was he under to do that? That is interesting. So I'm just going to read directly from the transcript of his own interview from Caltech, kind of like the main chairman over there at Caltech. Here's a couple. By the way, one of the reasons I think he got into trouble and they wanted him out so badly is that he recommended a new intelligence agency that could get around some of the infighting in the CIA. And he gave it a very interesting name, the International Operations Agency, the IOA. And then there were congressional hearings about IOA, and he got to recommend this. And I think that put him in very, very, it put him in the target sites, which is why they used all these rumors later to make sure that he wasn't in the Clinton administration, which is odd because he was in the Carter administration, he was in the Ford administration, he was in the Reagan administration, and then he left for private enterprise. Clinton got him back and wanted all of his intel knowledge, and he was forced out, and there were people like William Safire and other people behind that. Bob Dole as well was involved in that. But I think the reason, including the fact of the salacious rumors, they said all kinds of things about him, that he was gay, is consorting with prostitutes, just everything that you can imagine with this guy, which was very, very damaging. And they were able to run him out of that. But there are a lot of unanswered questions about it. And at the end, he said literally that the people on the Senate committee had conspired against pretty powerful language coming from an intel guy. I don't think he said it lightly. Okay. So the Caltech questioner says, just to orient ourselves, we're going to turn to the 1960s and the Kennedy administration. At the time John Kennedy was elected president, were you still in the Pentagon? Had you already moved to the destroyer at this point? Inman, I was still in the Pentagon, still on briefing team with Admiral Burke. We used to go, intel briefer and operations briefer, to the White House to brief President Eisenhower's son and occasionally General Goodpaster. Admiral Burke had arranged during the transition that Harry Allendorfer, who did the operations briefing, and Lieutenant Inman, referring to himself in the third person there, would go brief President-elect Kennedy. It couldn't have been more charming. I talked about the outside world for about 10 minutes, got a couple of good questions. He thanked me, and then Harry Ellendorfer talked for 45 minutes. We never got invited back again. What's the story there? Why weren't you invited back? Clearly, the president didn't want to spend that much time. Had Harry done his 10 minutes the way I did, we'd have had probably been on the regular schedule to provide updates. I left in January just at the time of the inauguration and came to Washington for a last visit before deploying the night of the inauguration. And all the balls, there was a snowstorm in Washington, so not a particularly happy time. Then I went on to the destroyer. I was already by that point on the destroyer until September 61. I came back to an office that the Navy had at NSA, the Navy Field Operations Intelligence Office. So what we have is a snapshot here of Inman briefing Kennedy, President-elect Kennedy, there. I don't even think he's ever put that on the record before. So we have a much more upfront interaction. He'll have a lot of criticisms for Kennedy and Kennedy's policy, and he will talk about how during the Cuban Missile Crisis and other things that Robert Kennedy was hostile towards him, and that he didn't have such a high regard there. And, I mean, Bobby Kennedy has that kind of reputation anyway, a little deeper. So he's talking a little bit, and they're asking him, what did you think of the Kennedy administration? They're trying to get some answers out of him. He's saying, I wasn't tracking larger strategic implications at that point. I wasn't concerned about it. I was very eager to maintain my politically independent status. I had no qualms about interacting with President Kennedy or interacting with the new appointees in the Kennedy administration. Interesting to me, while I had interacted with Senator Johnson when he was the majority leader in Texas, with family visiting and wanting tickets to go to the White House to tour, I never interacted with him as vice president during that time. He knew Johnson before Johnson became vice president. I found that interesting as well. I don't think anyone's really said this in relation to Inman before. And so they go a little bit deeper and say, from your vantage point, you perceived any differences to the intelligence interagency process at the Kennedy administration? And he said, well, I have to go back and think. That's when Helms had relieved Allen Dulles. He was a superb intelligence officer, and he was also a superb political player. He managed to be part of the Tuesday lunches at the White House. President Johnson, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Richard Helms, and the National Security Advisor. That took place a lot of those otherwise would have been national security meetings. There were some things that were really hashed out. Decisions were made. Sometimes Bobby Kennedy would join those lunches, but not always. He's giving us a lot of insight there about what's going on in the Kennedy administration, but he's also talking about Helms there. Now, he will talk very favorably about CIA Director Bush, future President Bush, and how he forged a tight relationship with him. So that's not such a good sign for Inman here. A little more on looking into the background here. And so they're asking him again, they're pressing him a little more on Kennedy, like, what did you think of Kennedy? What was your interactions like? And all the rest of it. And he said, well, Johnson, after the assassination, followed exactly the track that Kennedys were on. And I say the Kennedys because Bobby Kennedy always played a big role in the background in all this. The escalation came first, whether it was dealing with the Soviets. Johnson wasn't going to be accused of being softer than the Kennedys, and he kept Kennedy's team, Rusk, McNamara, and George Bundy. So he goes into this whole thing about how the Church Committee asked him, how did we get involved in Vietnam? What was going on there? And so this is how he originally got pulled into the Church Committee in 1975. Now, the Church Committee was investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, and the Vietnam aspect was a piece to look at how much the policy had changed between Johnson and Kennedy. So what he answers in a very interesting way. He says, when I came back, and particularly when I knew I was going to have to testify at the Church and Pike Committee timeframe. By the way, the Pike Committee records don't come out until 2049. That's how sensitive those records are. I did a lot of re-examining, just as I had done once with the 7th Fleet. What did they know, and when did they know it? But it was Kennedy's going to the moon, Johnson's role, which led to vice presidents heading the Space Council. I saw Vice President Harris had her first meeting at the Space Council recently, so that tradition continues. This interview takes place in 2022. But it's interesting, he loops in the Space Council thing for some reason out of nowhere. And he said, let me briefly go back to the response on Kennedy. The lesson I took away from it, how much I recognized at the time, I'm not sure, both opportunities and hazards of face-to-face meetings. The key here, the impact of the meeting in Vienna in 1961 between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Khrushchev came away with that meeting comfortable that he could intimidate Kennedy and achieve what he wanted to achieve. Now, I want to say this about Inman, if we can track this deeply, which is at the beginning of this interview, he says the exact opposite. He says that Kennedy stood up to Khrushchev and Khrushchev left the summit thinking he couldn't intimidate him. So he revisits his answer here and changes it to the fact that Kennedy was soft and he got intimidated. That led to the building of the wall in Berlin and ultimately the Cuban Missile Crisis. So how the other leader interprets can play out for a long period of time. I find this a strange thing for a guy who's very detail-oriented to say the exact different answer in the beginning to this answer. So there's something there where he wanted to correct it or how he was going to portray this interaction. While doing what I'm getting ready to testify before the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, the Church Committee was focused on whether we had supported efforts to assassinate Castro. Now, the official idea in the JFK investigation has been, were there plots to investigate Castro? And there are some authors who say, oh yeah, Kennedy wanted Castro eliminated through assassination. There's no evidence for it, zero. And interestingly enough, there are records on file of Kennedy saying, getting Robert Kennedy to go in there and stop the plots that they were doing, and also instructing the CIA not to assassinate the DM brothers who were running Vietnam. They get assassinated. The Central Intelligence Agency moves through a covert process to assassinate both brothers. They kill them 3 weeks before the president is assassinated. And for what I'm saying, they were involved in assassinating President Kennedy. So it's very interesting, this painting of the idea of Castro being involved. Now, what Inman says here is extraordinary, and it's why I'm taking a little bit of time here to really roll it out. What he says here, I'm going to read it, is that before he went to testify before the Church Committee, Defense Secretary James Schlesinger took him aside and said, here's all of this evidence about Kennedy and Robert Kennedy assassinating Castro. Now, he says, when they touch upon this, you can't talk about it, but I wanted to make sure that you saw it. All right. So oddly enough, there's no real reason to show him that if he's not going to talk about it, but they're saying stay away from it. Now, nowhere, we haven't seen anything, evidence like that, but he's stating in here that before he goes into the Church Committee, he's shown all this evidence, okay, that Schlesinger is saying, yeah, Kennedy, he was going to assassinate Castro. Here's all the evidence. You can look at it and you can't talk about it. Now, that's not substantiated anywhere. There are, there's definitely a CIA assassination plot against Castro. And apparently the best evidence on that is that Howard Hughes and, his CIA entourage are the ones who are involved in it, including Bob Mayhew, who hires Johnny Roselli for that. And that's where they involve this. But somehow this is a weird cover job around this. And it's very tricky because right in the heart of this period, Kennedy is using these various human intel assets, we call them human, to get information about what the CIA is doing with the mafia. And this spirals into one of the people who's doing it is Judith Exner, who is a Hollywood actress. She is acting as an intermediary. And at a certain point, she will show, to a researcher in 1997 that Kennedy was not sending money back and forth, that he was sending blueprints. And that he was getting back advanced technology blueprints from the people he was interacting with through these various figures. This is crucial, and this is what the committee needs to investigate, which is this is all about advanced technology. The entire mafia Cuban thing which certainly, was going on in the period of time, is just a cover layer for what the CIA was doing. It has nothing to do with Kennedy's policy. But it's very interesting because Inman is going to say here in his Caltech background policy that, in fact, no, I was shown all this stuff. But there's no substantiation because we've never seen any of what he's talking about. The Church Committee was focused on whether we had supported efforts to assassinate Castro, focused on Guantanamo as they appointed the staffer who was looking at our files for evidence. I'm referring back to things we've already talked about, but because of my time at the Vice Chief's office recognizing how important staffs were, I met the staffers who were going to examine us. We read the same files, we talked about what we found, we disagreed on its importance, etc. The Navy Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, had not been involved in any of the efforts to assassinate Castro. Only a naval officer at Guantanamo on his own had collaborated with CIA in looking to provide weapons that could be used for the assassination. There was no disputing of the facts here involved. I got the benefit of the doubt, and the Navy's involvement in that was closed down. The House Committee on Assassination was more serious. I believe I've already told you about my interaction with Secretary Schlesinger. Very important. Over the estimating process. If I'm repeating on this one, stop me. I was being called to testify before the Senate committee on whether we had helped in efforts to assassinate Castro. We've talked about that, but I don't think I told you. When we'd notify the Secretary of Defense, you're going to go, the word came back that Schlesinger wanted to see me. You go down, he said, there are some very sensitive files that I want you to read before you go testify so you won't accidentally report. You're not authorized to release anything about these files to Congress. Now, the Church Committee is in charge of all these intelligence leaks, and they put their witnesses under oath. You can't lie. So the defense secretary, in fact, is asking him to lie. Say, I'm going to show you stuff and you can't say anything about this. But also the stuff he's showing him has obviously been forged because we've never seen it. I want to make sure you're fully knowledgeable. Unquote. That was my exposure to the whole program to try to assassinate Castro, directed by the Attorney General. Now, the idea of Robert Kennedy running an assassination squad outside of President Kennedy's purview is absurd. There are legitimate authors who brought forward the idea that Kennedy continued after Mongoose and all that to operate anti-Castro groups, that they continued to cultivate them. But it looks to me like they just wanted to keep an eye on what those groups were doing. And there was never anything about, hey, let's go in after the Cuban Missile Crisis and assassinate Castro. I mean, that would have set off World War III. So this is extraordinary what he's putting on the record here, but I think we're getting a glimpse of what they're doing, one, with Inman, and also his own responses. This will come into incredible focus when we get to Inman and the UFO file, because it's the same process, in fact. And it is the holding of secrecy by saying, we have this secret that you need to keep. And therefore, when you talk about this, if you get asked about it, you can't. All right. You can't talk out of turn. That was my exposure to the whole program to try to assassinate Castro, directed by the Attorney General within the Defense Department, the assistant to Secretary McNamara, who would later go on to be Cabinet Secretary. Joe Califano was his assistant to Major Alexander Haig. Okay. The principal in the effort was the guy who helped run the counterinsurgency programs. And the schemes that the CIA came up with, exploding cigars and other things. All right, the Attorney General pursued every one of them. Why didn't they work? When their efforts were not successful, he directed the effort to be turned over to the mafia in Miami, Sam Giancana. All right, so the mafia in Miami is Santo Trafficante. Giancana ran Chicago. And so this is odd. This whole section and series is odd, and it leads to an incredible crescendo as we track along here. I can remember his mistress was Judith Exler, who was also one of President Kennedy's playmates. All right, this is very unofficial speaking. She was the human intelligence person that Kennedy was exchanging all of these things with defense contractors and mafia figures. And she certainly was, someone who was having an affair with Kennedy. Now, she's the one who put on the record this whole thing about the blueprints, which I think is absolutely crucial. And she did it in a book that was supposed to be a major hit piece on Kennedy by Cy Hirsch called The Dark Side of Camelot and all that. But what they didn't realize how powerful a revelation that was there in 1999. But here he is saying, oh, yeah, Robert Kennedy, by the way, who's doing a big anti-mafia purge, is going to go hire Sam Giancana to do all this. Now, there's all kinds of unusual, strange things about that. We've done it, including that Wise Guys in the Hot Zone episode. All of that weaving is very strange. But for him, in the middle of his own testimony, knowing the character that he is, knowing his own exposure to the UFO file, self-admitted, for him to bring up X again, Judith Exner is the one who brought forward the fact that President Kennedy was receiving blueprints, not payoffs, blueprints. And I'm sure, there was money exchanged and things of that nature. But the key is, why Kennedy getting secret blueprints? Because he knew there was an alternative, advanced, exotic technology piece that was going on outside of his purview, and he wanted all of that information. This is a huge revelation, and what's going on with Inman here, saying that Schlesinger showed him on the record all this stuff about Bobby Kennedy, which, by the way, never shows up on the record except in the suppositions and in the speculations of certain writers about it. There's no evidence that Kennedy ever ordered an assassination attempt against Castro. So what is he talking about? What are they showing him? And basically, before he goes into executive session, they're saying you can't talk about this. They're essentially saying, lie by omission. Don't say it. So it's all very odd. I wondered at the end of the day if it wasn't a way to keep him almost on a blackmail level, like, well, I showed you this stuff and, you didn't mention it before Congress. I don't know, but it's highly unusual. And the way he's kind of talking about it is unusual too. And I appreciate the frankness that Inman is expressing here. We've seen this frankness before, even though he's done all these denials around the UFO file. It is at times opening up. And we're going to get more into how powerful those explanations have been on the Inman side, because Inman is at the heart, and I mean the very heart, of the UFO file. Tonight's episode, the X series 200, and it is the Inman UFO file. We've got CIA, Joannides, PSYOP revealed, and now it's out there for the world to see. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program and going deeper still. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
David Termina, DJ, what do you make of the Richard Boylan story about Mark Felt telling Bob Woodward about a fantastic anti-gravity project, which Bobby Ray Inman was witness to, and even part of the Deep Throat revelations as a covert whistleblower?
It makes sense. It makes sense. The other thing that's interesting is that it seems with the idea of Inman that he was somebody who was an organizational genius. So, he could take something like the UFO file and organize it in such a way and maintain the secrecy. Over and over again, he talks about how we're not good at keeping secrets and how this all needs to be improved and that an intel secret is an intel secret. But oddly enough, he is also somebody who's engaged, as I mentioned, in some of the most open dialogue about these things. So there's something unusual going on there in the figure of Inman himself, which I think part of it can be cleared up by calling him before Congress and giving him a chance, because he has expressed at times, just like when, his nomination got squelched by forces like in the Senate Intelligence Committee and William Safire, the journalist, and others. He has a tendency to want the record to be put straight, but he also has the other tendency, which is I've kept all the secrets. So the only way you can really blow that open is by going right down the middle and saying, as a patriot before Congress, you're under oath, tell us the truth. And, you have someone in their 90s there, obviously, who's has an incredibly distinguished career, but it's crucial the thing is, we have an intersection of history here because Joannides has been exposed. Now, we've been exposing it on this program for years, but now it's exposed to the world. So you have an opportunity because of the awarding of the medal to Joannides to bring all of these things to the fore. That's the opportunity that Congress needs to take. And we're going to talk more about how this relates to the advanced technology part in this next stage of the Dark Journalist X Series 200. Here's the thing. Well, before we go any further, go to Dark Journalist if you're new, especially, and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch around all of this incredible. And you're going to see this episode get censored heavily, I guarantee it. But it's going to let you know about the incredible things we have coming up for you. The major surprises as well, I want to put out. So stand up and be counted. Make sure you're the first to hear all about it. Go to darkjournalist.com. What else have you got?
Also, David Termina. DJ, while Inman and Warner were at these positions, they were in charge of the Glomar Explorer project. Not only was Inman involved in the Glomar story, but also the Gough Whitlam Pine Gap controversy. Cuba.
Absolutely. And Glomar is so important because it's the Howard Hughes aspect and it brings us into the hot zone. But Glomar is crucial because it was set up to pull something off the bottom of the ocean. And here's the thing that we need to understand about Inman, which is when you think about the NRO, it was set up under the Kennedy administration. We didn't find out about it until the Clinton. And you also say to yourself, well, how many things that deal, and that was a whole satellite surveillance office that just, covered everything. And the public didn't know anything about it and yet supported it, funded it. So when we talk about things like a secret space program and things of this nature, in this period, you see how it makes sense. You see how 20 years from now we'll find out, there was an office doing this, they did for security purposes, they didn't tell anybody. Well, I would say in the current political climate, we can't afford that kind of secrecy. So this is the nature of the problem that we face in 21st century America and around the globe, which is the kind of secrecy that is maintained around these exotic technology programs isn't viable because it means anyone can come along and utilize it, for example, for a false UFO threat, which is what I've warned about with these counterintelligence guys pretending to be whistleblowers. They're not, and that the group of Elizondo and Mellon pushing that and setting up the UFO hearings is part of that. They want that UFO defense office. And they have some legislation that they're attaching to the NDAA, again, trying to move into this direction by saying, this UAP disclosure bill. But what it does is it establishes an office, you see, and the office is supposed to be the receptacle. And for some reason, this first version, Arrow, apparently didn't do the job or didn't have the backing. But they want to set up a UFO defense office, and they need these intelligence officers to roll out and peddle the threat thing in order to do that. The problem is, if the American public doesn't know about the UFO file, one, and two, about the agencies managing it, I'm sure there are agencies, I call those agencies X-Protect, they manage the UFO file. So if the American public doesn't know about that, then we're at an incredible disadvantage. And this is why the secrecy doesn't work in a 21st century environment. We have to keep that in mind as we're talking and giving advice to the task force and all the rest of it. And by the way, the task force is very aware. We even communicated with them at a certain point. They shut that off. But they're very aware of this show, the things that we've put up. At times they've mirrored exactly what we've been talking about in relation to some of these very delicate matters on the UFO and assassination side. So they're very, very aware. Guys like Burchett and stuff, they know all about dark journalism. Okay, let's go a little deeper with Inman and the UFO file. And here's where it gets particularly strange. So now we've learned a couple of things. One, we've learned that Inman briefed President Kennedy. This is very important. Two, that he didn't have warm feelings for Robert Kennedy in particular. And three, that he was pulled before the JFK assassination committees of the 1970s, like the Church Committee and the House Assassinations Committee, to testify in private. I've never heard that before. What's also interesting is that he's instructed at a certain point, here's all this stuff about Kennedy and what he's doing to assassinate this figure and that figure, but don't talk about it. But none of that information has ever been put out. So none of it is confirmed. So for that alone, the Luna Committee can put him on the stand. The crucial thing is going to be to put him on the stand or put him before Congress to give real testimony about what he knows in relation to Joannides, the UFO file. Okay, a little more on what happens here. I'm going to do this in reverse order. I'm going to bring you what the discoveries are, and then I'm going to show you how I got to them. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
All right. These are, I believe, emblems of the UFO redevelopment plan. And I think I've found them within the companies that Inman was working with either earlier or later in his career. Braddock, Dunn, and McDonald is the company that Inman would work for when he left government office. And he worked for a number of different companies and was on a number of different boards. But this company in particular, BDM, is interesting. And in my opinion, they were the ones who engaged heavily in UFO redevelopment. They became part of a major push for computing artificial intelligence as well. And what's going to be extraordinary about that group that Inman was running is that Marvin Minsky is in the heart of the group that develops into this other company, which I'll get into as well. But this emblem that I'm going to show you right now is, in my opinion, the stamp of the UFO redevelopment piece. You can take a look at that image there. It is a 3-part image, and I've been looking into a number of their patents. This is the patent that I believe relates directly to crash retrieval and redevelopment of UFO parts. And
what leads you to believe that?
Well, it is the presence of Inman and his expertise in the middle of it, but also if you go through what they are and what they develop, their whole point is to take certain types of technology, keep them hidden but proprietary, and roll them out to the public in some fashion. That is what you would do, and it's what Stanton Friedman said was done with the UFO file. Now, there's a lot for each of these that I can show you that relate directly to redeveloped UFO technology and how Inman is involved. For the sake of time, I'm just going to cover these 2, but there's actually more like 6. All right, here's the other emblem of UFO redesign. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Drum roll, please, Miss Olivia.
I can't do it.
There it is. Autonetics. Take a good look. Autonetics is a division of North American Aviation. North American Aviation is a division of Rockwell International. Rockwell International has shown up in the X series 4 different times for their role in advanced aerospace. But the other thing that is quite important to note about Rockwell is there's a letter that I've put on record, which has since disappeared from the archives, but I have it, which is a letter about the top donor to the Edgar Cayce Foundation. And his name was Willard Rockwell. And what he, being a student of the readings, wanted to do was buy a substantial landmass near Bimini for purposes of exploring what Cayce said was a power source that was there in Bimini. Let's give you a little bit of autonetics, and then I'm going to go into that trail. Will you be ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. We're going to try this. Watch closely. Autonetics was a division of North American aviation that produced various avionics, but is best known for their inertial navigation system used in submarines and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Its 188-acre facility in Anaheim, California, with 36,000 employees, was the city's largest employer. Through a series of mergers, Astronautics is part now of Boeing. They landed in good hands. Autonetics originated in North American Aviation's Technical Research Laboratory, a small unit in Los Angeles Division Engineering Department in 1945. The laboratory won an Army Air Forces contract to develop 175 to 500-mile Ranger glide missiles. Now, what we're going to learn about North American aviation is the X-15, which is a craft that was developed by Walter Dornberger and represents this X technology that is so famous on this program. And it certainly held the record for a space plane that was manned until just recently, which is extraordinary because it came out in 1960. Interestingly enough, Colonel Corso, in some of his various disclosures there in the 1990s, said that the X-15 was developed and used by the Kennedys to track UFOs, and that he gave them briefings on what it was able to do. So they see a UFO, they sent up the X-15 to chase after it because it was the fastest manned plane that we had. Now, the X-15 was developed with this X technology coming out of the German program. That's why Dornberger's at the helm of the entire project. Dornberger, of course, famously shows up later as the VP at Bell Aerospace, and his understudy there is Michael Payne. That's who works for him, and Payne is housing Oswald. So all of that works together very interestingly, but it is Rockwell who develops the X-15. They own North American Aviation. So Rockwell becomes much more important in the middle of all of this. And what you're going to find out is that Bobby Inman, in the 1980s, when he leaves his position there as deputy CIA director, goes and works at a new company, and the people that he's working with are Rockwell and BDM. So the two companies each are involved in this UFO redevelopment program. Keep this logo in mind. All right, a little bit, and this goes far outside the field of traditional reporting on Inman and this subject, but Rockwell is going to become so important. I'm going to do it. First, let's take a look at Willard Rockwell. Willard Rockwell led the company through a number of different hardcore developments in these leaps in space, and eventually his company became the lead developer in the Apollo program and also in the Challenger program. So all of the space projects, these guys are getting the big rewards in relation to this. They're getting the big projects, and they are coming through for the government. Now, something very odd on the record back here, which is a letter that was written, as I mentioned. I'm going to read you the exact letter. And I want to say a few things about Rockwell first. Willard Rockwell was an American engineer, businessman who helped shape and name what eventually became the Rockwell International Company. He created and directed a number of major corporations with a wide range of products, automobiles to aviation and related industry. By the 70s, he was a leading figure in American defense industry. They made the missiles and everything else. If it moves, we probably made some part of it, was his boast. And he's from Boston, interesting. And he went through MIT and moved to Pittsburgh, home of the Mellons there. So just keep him in mind, that brief biographical sketch there. So what happens is there's a few things about Rockwell which come under the headline of extraordinary. One of them is the fact, as I mentioned, that he was the top donor to the Cayce Foundation during the 19th. Now, Edgar Cayce was the sleeping prophet. We've done so many programs on him. And he had the ability to go into trance and produce incredible details, whether it was medical details or retrocognitive details, things about our ancient past. And his accuracy is off the charts. It's still not understood. There were a number of doctors who studied Cayce and brought him before committees and things like that. They just could not figure out how he did what he did. So Cayce certainly, in terms of the psychic track, incredibly bona fide figure. And he's included in so many of our documentaries and shows here in the X series. But Edgar Cayce's work, I still think, is not completely understood, including its impact, the fact that he gave readings for figures like Woodrow Wilson, and the fact that he gave readings for figures like Henry Wallace, vice president, and just how important he was in those circles. Now, this is a letter from a character named Trig Adams, who I talked to, as a very famous pilot around the Atlantis Bimini Wall piece, and he is the son of Margaret Saunders, who, Colonel Sanders, Margaret Sanders. And by the way, Margaret Sanders is a very crucial figure if you want to understand anything about the advanced technology obsession going on in the Epstein circles. And I'll tell you why. But first, here's the letter. It's to Hugh Lynn Cayce, Edgar Cayce's son. And it says, "Dear Hugh Lynn, it's come to my attention that Colonel Rockwell, head of North American Rockwell Corporation, is a member of the ARE, which is the Cayce Foundation. A subsidiary of that company has recently been acquiring large areas of Bimini and islands south for developmental purposes, much like those suggested in the Cayce reading. I'm led to believe that the readings provided the impetus for this action, although I doubt that at the corporate level this would be widely known or known at all. I was hoping that you might be able to give us any information on this, and if it is not supported, if it's not supposed to be a secret and you know of any, also if it would be possible to arrange an introduction through you of Colonel Rockwell, it sure would be helpful. I feel that the Colonel would be very interested in the work of MARS and the approach it takes. MARS is the company that Margaret Sanders, the daughter of Colonel Sanders, the Colonel, Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, and he is her daughter, her son, I'm sorry. The Colonel's daughter is his mother. The data has not come back yet from the last trip to Bimini a few weeks ago, where we used $35,000 worth of fancy electronic gear loaned to us by the manufacturer for a survey. We also hope that it will continue another link in the chain of being forged, and the scientific community will keep you informed. Apologies to Edgar Evans for my not writing to them individually. I'm sure you'll understand. And then he says something about pictures at the bottom here. So it's Trig Adams writing in 1969, and he is part of this group with Colonel Sanders, as Colonel Sanders' grandson. They're exploring. The group is called Mars, and it's marine archaeology research. And that whole group is spending time right there in the hot zone because Edgar Cayce has said there's an Atlantean power source. Now, I want you to flash back to what I said about Inman. Inman was in charge of the underwater NRO, as was John Warner. So the idea of an ancient power source is something that these guys would be very familiar with in relation. But Rockwell, which Inman will go and work for, they are the top donor to the Cayce Foundation in the 1960s. And here is Trig Adams, who's very aware of all the research going on around Atlantis, saying, I know that Rockwell is buying up all this property around Bimini because of the readings. Can you basically get me an introduction? Now, this is an article from 1971, and listen closely to what Rockwell has engaged in here around Bimini. It's the Miami Herald, and it's from November 9th, 1971, a couple years later. Resort plans to include history theme The Bahamas government announced yesterday that an agreement with North American Rockwell Corporation for engineering studies, which may lead to a multi-million-dollar development for North and South Bimini as a resort and recreational area with historical and wilderness theme. Development Minister Jeffrey Thompson said that the project would be a joint venture of the government and the American company. Terms of the partnership will be based on 1,800 acres of government land with Rockwell's engineering studies, development capital, and additional land from the 700 acres presently owned. Keystone of the project is dredging of a 12-foot harbor in East Wells Inlet to accommodate large cruise ships and daily service between Miami to Bimini. Stay close with me. The engineering studies now underway will also determine the feasibility of building a marina for fishing, for pleasure craft, recreating an old Bahamas town in the harbor, and building the city of the future. The centerpiece of the latter would be a tower featuring an underwater restaurant and bar. The proposed recreational park with its historical and wilderness theme would be along the shore of North Bimini. Scale models of the Bahamas Islands will be constructed in canals, and dramatic elements of Bahama history will be created. The landfall by Columbus, the quest of Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth, the era of the pirates, others, all by the Rockwell Corporation. Here comes the payoff. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Included in the agreement is the granting of exclusive exploration rights to a series of underwater ruins located several hundred feet off the Bimini coast. The ruins have been described as being part of a wall and connected to the legendary lost continent of Atlantis. Their authenticity would be determined by the exploration. So Rockwell moves in and says, we're going to do all these incredible things. We have these hotels and all the rest of it. But I'll tell you what, the one thing we want in there are the rights to control all the land around the Bimini wall. Now, this is extraordinary.
So this is a deal.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They're providing industry.
Yes.
It's that sort of a thing in order to have those, have a monopoly on those.
Yes,
rights.
but here's the thing. Rockwell is an aerospace company.
Yes.
They are, and we just finding out from Trig Adams that they're a huge donor to the Cayce Foundation because Willard has gotten so much from the Cayce readings, and now he wants to apply all that to go down and get the power source.
Yep.
So oddly enough, they do end up becoming a major force in Bimini, but also they buy up the tiny island of Western Bahamas, Cayce. About 30 years until 1964, it was an exclusive and expensive playground for American millionaires and their friends. Last May, Willard Rockwell Jr., the board chairman of North American Rockwell, and a group of fellow investors purchased Cayce, and since that time have restored and improved much of the original club facilities, and on they go. This is a shot of some of the promotion that they were doing about it, and it's very interesting because it's all about Cayce and what they did. A few years later, Al Rockwell and the head of Rockwell International put together a small group and bought the island of Cayce, especially to make it a private club owned by its members. Now, what I'm getting at is, and something about some conversations I had with John Warner in relation to his dad and also in relation to Inman, and also the fact that his dad would go to this little location there in the Bahamas, and the whole thing was highly secret. Apparently, the Rockwell group was deep in the Cayce work, and they were going deep under Bimini for this, and they wanted all the surrounding terrain as well. So they got things like Cayce, etc. Now, they became part of Boeing, and I will tell you this. Now, this is a 2012 article. We're going to update. We're going to move about 50 years into the future. Bimini's new $250 million Rockwell Island luxury home development breaks ground. So North American Aviation Rockwell gets sold off to Boeing, but this real estate company continues to control all of that luxury housing around Bimini. And guess what else? They got all the rights to everything around the Bimini Wall. So this is extraordinary moves by a group deep, deep inside using the mystery school knowledge of Edgar Cayce around Atlantis, but somehow this group is deeply involved with NASA. They're the ones who send Apollo to the moon. They're the ones who send Challenger up. And, this is one of the most powerful aerospace groups of all. And then they merge into Boeing, which is, basically the top of the top in relation to all that. Now, in our own research, we've focused on this area in the hot zone. And it's very telling here for the 200th episode to say, we've done over 25 episodes in the hot zone, but it's this area that was pointed out to me by a number of people who worked in either military jobs or private industry jobs that's had to sign things that said, if you see any ruins down there, if you see the Temple of Isis or something, you can't say anything about it. You can't, come back up after your submarine trip and call ABC News and say, I just saw a pyramid down there. And the reason they keep those rules is because in that area, that hot zone area, there are a number of different ruins. Now, in those episodes and in the documentary that we did, The Craze in the Hot Zone, Hacking Atlantis, you will find a British intelligence officer saying it's a well-known open secret among all of these intelligence factions that there are major ruins right there in the hot zone. So this is part of a geopolitical intrigue that's been going on and may have fueled things even to the point of the Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond. But at the heart of it was an aerospace company, Rockwell. Eventually, in the 1980s, Rockwell is going to be working with Inman. And Inman is the very heart of secrecy around the intel groups, but working very hardcore in the heart of the UFO file. These things, bringing together these things, is going to open up that entire level of X-Tech. It's going to bring us to a totally different level of understanding what's going on here. And I'm going to go further into it through the figure of John Alexander, who is Colonel Alexander, famous in UFO and remote viewing circles, and also very into things like voodoo experimenting and the men who stare at goats, that whole bit. As we go into the second section of X-200, this is the Bobby Inman UFO file, CIA Joannides PSYOP revealed, but you can see with an X series twist, very hardcore in the middle of it. Yes.
Okay. Rat Boy Genius says Rockwell also made navigation systems for submarines, not just aerospace. And Peter Nass says, and the mobile weapons system that looks like a sea transport box is called Club Key. It's Key, not K.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, right. What's interesting is I was looking at a dinner invite list for the Nixon White House, and I found 14 different visits by the North American Rockwell Corp Autonetics Division. That's UFO redevelopment, guys. So this is part of Rockwell here. So these guys are.
I wanted to
hold
share
on one second.
Okay.
That's the list, a part of the list there, and you can see this is Nixon's actual list of dinner guests. So there's one example. There's 14 there. Yes. What do you got?
Okay, you didn't give me a chance to ask any questions about Autonetics. So David Donaway says Autonetics sounds like cybernetics applied to semi-autonomous machines with some level of AI.
Yes.
Rat Boy Genius says that logo is a sine wave, frequency and vibration.
Yes.
And which is what I thought immediately. And R Dopery says it stands for tune A to 432 hertz. Ha ha.
Interesting. Autonetics was a division of North American Aviation that produced various avionics, but is best known for their inertial navigation system. So I read this. So that's what it was.
Okay.
I have read this part, but it's good to kind of revisit it. Autonetics originated in North American Aviation's Technical Research Lab, a small unit in the LA division. So there's more, of course, on these guys, but there's actually 6 different companies, but I'm focusing on those 2. So there's probably going to be more as well. The first airplane flight of an inertial auto navigator, the XN1 in 1950. There's some X-Tech rolling out for you. The first flight of an all-solid-state computer for the Navajo Guidance System, 1955. Navigation system for the first submerged crossing of the North Pole on board the USS Nautilus. So highly successful company. It seems like Rockwell had the Midas touch in relation to everything that they did, and even their sprawling luxury real estate thing is an incredible boon for
May I,
Bimini.
may I see the
Yeah, which one?
auto?
Oh yeah.
You we have a request for you to hold it upside down.
Wait a minute. Oh, this one?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Upside down. There you are. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that line through it is like the ocean, and
Yes.
I hadn't thought of it, but when you do hold it upside down, it does feel like that.
Yeah, I want to point out, and remember there's 6 of these companies. I believe that all of them are engaged in UFO redevelopment of some type. But the other one, Braddock, Dunn, and McDonald, take a look at their, now that you've spent a little time on the other logo, look at their logo. This is their logo for a patent that they took off the market. It came on in 1963. They didn't do anything with it. But I will tell you that this company was engaged in basically utilizing what they had done in the redevelopment of the UFO fund. Both of those companies. So I believe that both of these are symbols for that. Now, what each one could mean, I'd be open to the interpretation. I like what I'm hearing so far in relation to this one. I think the other one is even more difficult to figure out. But
I think
here's
it's interesting. It's made of 3 pieces, and not that the image itself would make sense, but on the second time looking at it, I thought air, earth, water.
oh,
You know,
interesting.
but it's interesting. You don't usually get logos that are lined up like that.
How does the BDM one
vertically.
strike you?
Ideas?
No. How does the BDM?
I don't know. I mean, it looks very mid-century modern stylistically. Somebody said cuneiform.
Oh yeah, it does.
Mhm.
Well, here's what's interesting about it for me. The first 2 have these 3, and then the second one has nothing. Right? It's 2 edges, and these 2 have edges. Now, what's interesting about that for me is the symbolism that they would use. You know, you do when you are a company that has taken what was a private UFO file inside the government, and then you can take it into your records, because we know that this happened in the 1950s. It moved into corporate wings. So this kind of unstable piece between corporate America and the government, with the Intel Aerospace right in the middle. And that's the uneasy track that we've been on ever since. And it comes up even in these battles that you see over the Space Force, the Golden Dome, and these things. As a matter of fact, all of the group that Inman works with in the 1980s are all involved in SDI. So what you're getting, and what's in the heart of this, is when they're working on this, you still need the ability to portray it. You need a steganography so that certain people can understand it. Now, here's the thing about steganography. If I want to tell people to watch a particular program and track it, and I'm dealing with 20,000 CIA agents, I don't want to tell each one of them what the program is. I just want to give them enough knowledge to track through the steganography, and then they can give me the reports. I know what the thing is. So in terms of X-Steganography, that's how they did it with over 200 programs. And, when we're doing all of these programs around it, I've said that basically maybe like a fifth or even less of what I've discovered about X-Steganography is out there in the public. What it means is that what's going on in the background is they need a way to communicate with each other that still looks like nothing to us on the surface. That's the key of steganography, and why it's different from cryptography, which very often is something where people try to solve a puzzle around something. Steganography works. It's there. It's in plain sight. Nobody knows what it is except the initiate involved. So that's why learning to read steganography is so crucial.
Oh.
And that whole thing about steganography goes back to Johannes Trithemius, and I've put him on the record because what he needed to do, he's a very unusual character in history, was he needed to get these incredible magical formulas out, but he was an abbot inside of this monastery, And he realized that he needed to place a page within a page, or else he would become, they might call him, demonic for working on this stuff. So he utilized steganography, the page within a page that he had learned from Greek research. That's where all of steganography comes from. So when you get all the secrecy around the UFO file in the 20th century, which holds up remarkably well if you think about it, into the 21st century, it all comes from this ancient steganography. That's the heart of the X steganography. That's why you have X coming through as the Elon Musk piece and all the rest of it. I've tried to explain that from a couple of point of views. One point of view is the research track that goes all the way back into ancient history, into ancient Atlantis. The other track just picks up that X steganography after people like Vannevar Bush take over the UFO file. That's the X steganography that we're dealing with now. And they're connected. The mystery schools kept that X imagery years and years for a good reason. Yes.
So that actually is BDM. When you look at it, it's the logo vertically.
Oh, good.
So, but what I think is interesting is that it is.
Where do you see?
No,
that?
it's B. The first one is top, B and M.
You're saying that's a B?
Yeah, that's a B. But it's actually highlighting the negative space around.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Letter
Yes.
Instead of the letter itself, and that would lead me to think about invisibility. I may be stretching there, but
yeah.
it's just,
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah,
a
yeah,
very
yeah.
interesting. I've never seen.
I think it's
another logo
extraordinary.
that
Yeah.
actually highlights the negative space around the letter versus the letter itself.
Yes. Yeah, I think between the two, we're getting the first hints of what is actually in the Autonetics case. Well, this is the symbolism used around the redeveloped X technology. Remember, the X technology is in the UFO file because they do the exact same thing. Not X technology doesn't have to be extraterrestrial, by the way. X technology is also the Nikola Tesla work. It's what the mystery schools kept that Keeley did. But oddly enough, what they learned, if you go into this, is that on the intelligence side, they learned that the UFO file operated just like the X technology, and it created the Sapothium effect. That is the fear inside of those agencies, that there is this unpredictable reality distortion physics at the very heart of the UFO redevelopment process. If you read some of the earliest stories, which are the most accurate around the Aztec UFO case, for example, they could only send the scientists in there for 20 minutes at a time. They learned they would either get very ill or they would have very unusual, basically psychedelic visions. And in some cases, they'd go in there, they would be looking at, these alien components, or they'd work on an alien body, and then they would start to see a deceased relative. They would start to go into a psychic quantum state. So whatever was going on there is opening up all sorts of things, in their chakra system or whatever it happens to be. So you need here's the thing about the UFO file and why the way that we track it in traditional, like, alternative media doesn't work, and why you get people like Elizondo and all this nonsense. It has nothing to do with just traditional logistics as we understand them, because the Apothium thing wipes out any record of any normal physics. That's why you have missing time. That's why in John Mack's work, as he explained to me years ago, the late John Mack, that when you had abductions, people would not be pulled up and out, they would be pulled through. So you get abducted through a wall. You don't get sucked out a window. And so the thing that they're doing defies physics. So when you're experiencing all these things, when these people go back to study it and keep that level of X-Protect secrecy around it, it's not just, we have to hide the fact that they're alien. It is this, we haven't learned to aim this technology. And it's an unpredictable factor because it completely distorts time and space. That's the thing that they, in my opinion, have not figured out about it. That's why the UFO file is the top national security secret. It's because of the volatility of that technology, that exotic technology. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Woo! Deep in here into X Series 200. Obviously, this is going to be a two-parter everyone. But it's the UFO file, CIA, Joannides, PSYOP revealed. We're taking your questions here shortly, and we are going deep into now this connection with Rockwell and an ancient source. And I want to give a little bit of meat to the bones of the ancient technology idea. First of all, these people that are doing underwater investigation under the Neuro, which is the underwater branch, which Inman was in charge of, and John Warner, Senator Warner, was in charge of. They have something in common with other people who show up in a kind of scandalous side, like, for example, Ghislaine Maxwell, who through Terramar was doing all of this underwater, and founding an ocean nonprofit and all the rest of it. Now, one of the tragic things that came up around the Epstein stuff was the death of Virginia Giuffre. She was somebody who had testified on the Epstein case and had called out Prince Andrew. Her testimony is so rich and so loaded with important pieces of information. But one of the most important pieces of information that I found was that they were targeting Alexandra Cousteau, who was the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau. Now, Alexandra Cousteau, it's very interesting. Her dad had done all of these underwater Atlantis, these different expeditions, and he knew so much about that undersea world. So when we say Navy is involved with the UFO file, they are the lead on the UFO file. And they have the best facilities and the best background for dealing with the UFO file, oddly enough. Now, just as a quick little bit on this Minsky with Inman part, I want to put this on the record and then explain the rest. So there's this kind of super genius guy in the 1980s, and he ends up trying to do the talking back and forth of artificial intelligence. Because remember, artificial intelligence has been going on since the 1950s, probably further back. The cybernetics conferences, the Macy conferences, 1946. So it's been on the docket here for a long time. Now, Bobby Inman flew to California to meet with this researcher, LISZT. He was the one who was the super computer genius. This is in the 1980s when he's putting together this large computer consortium, and Rockwell is involved. So there's a man named LISZT and a woman named Shepard, and he wants to meet them both at Stanford. And Shepard was living across the country in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time, working for an early AI company called Thinking Machines. But she and LISZT were a couple, something Inman didn't realize until his own wife clued him in. After the meeting, he brought Shepard and LISZT to Austin, Texas. He clearly was way over the horizon in what he wanted to think about, Inman says of LISZT. What I admired about him from the beginning was his vision. He calls LISZT a classic nerd. Shepard says that they took the job because Austin was the place that she and LISZT could agree upon. LISZT hated Cambridge, she said, because of the snow, and I hated Palo Alto because of the earthquakes. They believe that the project's higher purpose. LISZT says that he and his closest friends, including Cayce and Marvin Minsky, and some of the biggest names in AI, believe that someone should tackle the problem of instilling computers with common sense. He admits that this was a chaotic pursuit in 1986. 2 years into the project, he told Time it would require 350 human years of work to even approach success. After all, the scope of human knowledge is always growing. Now, Marvin Minsky had a frequent visitor, and his name was Jeffrey Epstein. There they are, discussing artificial intelligence right there at MIT. Now, Minsky had a best friend, and Minsky's best friend was Margaret Sanders. Margaret Sanders.
I still can't believe this.
Margaret Sanders was the daughter of Colonel Sanders. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit about Colonel Sanders. very early in his life, he went to work in Cuba, and he spent 5 years in Cuba. Now, it's very interesting that his daughter will become obsessed with Atlantis and the Cayce readings and things of this nature when she grows up. But she also had incredible connections in her life, including President Nixon, Eisenhower, and her other friend, Einstein. This is a sculpture that she did of her father here. That's Margaret Sanders, whose best friend was Marvin Minsky. You have to understand why Epstein was targeting Minsky and why Epstein and Maxwell were targeting these scientists, because it doesn't make any sense just on the surface of it. That's the key if you want to look at Epstein properly. And so I've put it on the record in the Hot Zone episodes and in the documentary, The Craze in the Hot Zone. But let me tell you, this one goes deep. But let's add another figure to that pile around the Hot Zone. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
And remember, all of these things are not taken out of context. There you have Inman. It's Inman who's working with this company, bringing together Minsky and these other people. They're all in this soup. John Alexander, who's known in UFO circles, he's kind of the dark figure in the UFO field. And what I will say this about Alexander is he has put a lot of things on the record about, the different people around the UFO file. John Alexander describes his assignment in 1972 as an infantry officer in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, before which time he went diving in the Bimini Islands in search of the lost continent of Atlantis. So John Alexander's in the hot zone, diving at Bimini as part of his job as an infantry officer at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. He becomes part of this ultra-secret group investigating the UFO file, and so many people know the background on Alexander. But now what we can add there is that he's involved in the search for Atlantean technology, ruins, and everything else in Bimini, just like our friends Rockwell. So we're going into some deep territory when we get this. And I will say that he's experimented with everything from remote viewing, black magic, voodoo, you name it. And also, psychic attack, psychic defense. He's explored it all in the context of the government. But he always shows up there in that UFO file, which I find interesting. The other thing I want to put on the record is that North American Aviation, the Rockwell Company, now, remember, he's the top donor to the Cayce Foundation, and we found him now exploring Atlantis. Take a look at that logo for North American. That is a pyramid with basically, the kind of the Egyptian god floating on by. So you're instantly, the territory you get into instantly is on a totally different level. We start to look at these people on a totally different level and understand what they're doing and what they're communicating with their own steganography, for example. And just to bring all of that ancient technology part into kind of an understanding of how it could apply to modern technology, the NASA scientist who investigated the Cayce-2i stone story about the Atlantean power source and what they had, determined that it could do all the things based on what Cayce was. He tried to make a scale model of it. And he made this scale model in 1974. That is his model of Cayce's 2i stone, which was a 6-sided crystal figure that was operated by sun and star energy and was the central power grid for the Atlantean. So this, this has all kinds of different aspects, including scientific aspects. It's got an ancient mystical aspect, but there's also a dead hardcore aspect. And of course, Clarence Bloomfield Moore, I've pointed out before, found this, which I believe is an early graph of the 2i stone power station in Florida, right there in the hot zone. And, they've tried to tie it to different things, but it's a real anomaly. Let me tell you, there's nothing You have all these basically like, arrowheads and things like that around, and then there's this. So that's a totally different culture and extraordinary, I would say, in that. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
There's a lot of information about the MITRE Corporation and RAND and whatnot. David
Yeah.
Dunaway says there's a tight crossover between SAIC and CERCO and MITRE, especially for geodes and low Earth orbit surveillance. James Schlesinger, MITRE Corporation Chairman, RAND Corporation Director of Strategic Studies, 63 to 69. Scarlet Fire says, I just worked on the MITRE campus in Burlington, Mass.
Oh, wow.
1958, the MITRE Corporation is chartered as a private not-for-profit company to provide engineering and technical guidance for the U.S. Air Force. The MITRE Corporation receives a large amount of funding from the U.S. government. Of its 2023 reported revenue of about $2.4 billion came from government grants. $2.4 billion.
Oh, yeah. Incredible. They're deep in the process. I think you're going to find the web of companies. And they're very good about merging the companies. You notice how Rockwell merges into Boeing and nobody's the wiser for anything that they did. And I think that we can see that in relation to a number of different aviation and aerospace companies. So it's a kind of a very smart consolidation feat. The company I want to mention in relation to Inman is MCC. And there are, what's interesting is the CIA kept files on Inman. Like tracking files after he left. And oddly enough, there was an article in one of those files, and it's Admiral Inman in command at the consortium. MCC research team is ready for business. July of 85, after he leaves both the NSA and the CIA, and he is running this very unusual MCC group with Rockwell. I believe that he figured that I can't go any further in traditional government, and that what I can do, these governments now are moving the UFO file into the public, and they need to keep their various IP proprietary, especially since it relates to the UFO file. So it won't be secret, but it will be proprietary. And as a result of that, they need somebody who really is aware of what was going on. So they bring him into that company. Now, this is going to end this string of Inman going in and out of the UFO field is going to end with this encounter with X in terms of anything public that we know about it. And I want to get into the Exler part as a way to curve the arc of the story of Inman and the UFO file with the CIA Joannides connection. And then we're going to take your questions. How's that sound? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Ooh, you're going deep. X-200, the Inman UFO file, CIA, Joannides PSYOP revealed, but you got a dose there of the hot zone and its connection. And let me tell you, the hot zone comes up so much in relation to this research that I've been convinced for decades that the hot zone is a crucial aspect around the whole piece around space, advanced technology, UFO file, and geopolitics. It's all there somehow in relation to the hot zone. And there's a reason for that. So let's just put a couple of things on the record, which is we mentioned neuro. So this is the underwater version of the NRO. And there we have a picture of Warner and his dad. And his dad was a director of neuro from 72 to 74. He also was the director of the Navy. And he also, of course, was a long-running senator. But he was a member of Majestic as well. And so he and Inman were members of Majestic, and he was around when Warner was growing up. So Warner tells me this story, and I put it out in a clip from an interview I did with him last year. And I just put that up on Twitter X, but this is very interesting. So he's at this thing in the year 2000. It's in Washington, D.C., and it's this big group meeting, all these senators and everything else. and they're all excited because next year they're going to roll out. What are they going to roll out? Disclosure. And Bobby Inman's like, I can't wait for this. We have all this technology through the Navy that I've been waiting for disclosure and all of the kind of UFO aspect. And he says, interestingly enough, we didn't get disclosure. We got 9/11 instead. So somehow the plan for disclosing all of this stuff in the year 2001, which Inman was so excited about and probably spent his whole career building up to, turns into the 9/11 terrorist COG emergency powers takeover. And we deal with that for years and years and years with the terrorist takeover. And then they blend it into other things like the financial coup d'etat, and then finally the COVID op, and God knows what they have lined up next. But it is very interesting to me, the conversation in private that takes place between Warner and Inman, who, after all, knew his dad, and they both ran the NURO.
I'm just sort of coming to the conclusion that the reason for that is
the reason for
why we didn't get, this is a big conversation, but the world was working towards it had a certain timeline. We were on a certain trajectory.
Oh yeah.
And I've cited many times, everything changed with 11.
Yes.
You just have to go back to that. But why was that decision made? Who was behind it? And is Epstein the toehold that we have to understand it? Is he central to understanding the shift of power?
I think you could understand it for a figure like Maxwell. I've actually always felt, even though Epstein dealt with all these presidents and things of that nature, I've always felt he was a much lower level figure.
I don't mean it like that. I mean the people behind.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say it. So basically, was Inman a patriot and thinking America first on some level? Did the tentacles of control shift in the 90s? And so that we lost sovereignty? Is that what we're really talking about here?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, actually. Something dramatic changed, as we know from people who've been in government and come on this program, that the 1990s, toward the end of the 1990s, everything changed. And suddenly the object came to be about centralization of power and America, America's through before the America First. But that is fascinating. I want to put a couple of quick things on record here. By the way, that is Warner meeting with Queen Elizabeth, with Liz Taylor and Gerald Ford. But the level that he was operating on, and just absolutely, operating in the top circles. And those people are very aware of what's going on in relation to these deeper projects. What I want to suggest is that this underwater reconnaissance group, by the way, I found out that, President Kennedy, when he was part of the Navy, one of his assignments was 4 months of tracking submarines in Florida off the coast, right there in the hot zone. And when you think about all the things that we've done in relation to Ernest Hemingway and other things, it is extraordinary because Hemingway is also a Cayce connection, and he's getting all these readings about Bimini. He goes to Bimini, and then he's going back and forth from Bimini to Cuba, mapping the ocean floor, and nobody knows what he's up to. So there's some kind of intelligence network that is centered on underwater. And of course, AUTEC is deeply involved in that. But before AUTEC really has the reins, this other group, Neuro, is hardcore. Here's a couple of quick things in relation to Inman and what he had to say about this. He's talking about JPL here, and he's doing very kind of boilerplate stuff about how they'll be successful and all the rest. He goes, again, it's going back to the administrator of NASA, who has a role to play in protecting, particularly if you let bureaucracy just decide what's going to be done. A lot of it will never occur. This takes me all the way back to my Navy days and the National Underwater Reconnaissance Program. My NSA days, the director has to be on the lookout for cutting-edge advances that you frequently want to protect in highly tight security because you don't want an adversary to become aware of the potential breakthrough talent. So how you establish, create, and manage what are referred to as black programs is always a challenge. That's what he did for the UFO file. And he was a genius guy to do it. But he's referencing there the National Underwater Reconnaissance Program. So the high level of secrecy of whatever they were doing there makes him trip into the black program idea. And those are the kind of cues in conversation you need to look for when somebody's talking about something. And I have to say, when we're getting around Inman, we're really looking at somebody who you could almost call the king of black project because he's deeply involved for so many decades. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this section with the whole piece about Exler and his conversation. Now, this has come up in every major work around the UFO file. Of course, Dr. Farrell's covered Inman and Exler, and I really have taken great pains to be exact about this. Here's the thing. A lot of people have run around after the fact, and there's a post-mortem thing around Exler saying, oh, Exler, was a scammer and all this stuff. Let me tell you, Exler had been at Wright-Patterson. He was exposed to the UFO file there. He had been in Vietnam. He was part of the Goddard program at NASA. He was a heavy. So people who tell you that or try to spin Exler are either uninformed or intentional disinformation artists. Exler approaches through Timothy Good and Admiral Lord Hill Knowlton, who was very, very convinced that the UFO file was crucial. And over there in the UK, he just felt that the secrecy was absurd in war conditions. So he had this to say after these things came out about Inman and Exler, which are taped, by the way. Their whole conversation is taped, and this is a transcript. I'm going to read some. But this is what Lord Hill Knowlton had to say about it. Some of those prominent persons in the United States to whom Timothy Good has referred to in this book have denied what he reports them to have said. I find it significant that they have taken no other action, either publicly or in the courts. No doubt readers of this edition will draw their own conclusions. He's right. If Exler had been lying or if Good had been lying, none of this stuff would have ever made it. It would have been, the publisher would have been shut down by a legal suit, and that would have been that. Instead, they just said, oh no, I didn't say that. But we have recordings of them saying it. So they said too much. And it came in through an angle. It was actually Norton who helped them, who helped Good and Exler get a meeting to Inman. And Inman, in a very cagey way, is trying to help our friend along. But he doesn't want to say anything that implicates him because of his positions. But he says some very interesting things. And I'm going to read them here, which is a direct transcript directly out of their meeting. And so Exler has Inman on the phone, and he says, thanks for returning my call. You remember who I am? And they go through this whole thing because they met before, and he already got that openness to the UFO file side from Inman. And he says, they're going deep into it, and he says, they're talking about Bill Norton. And he says, oh yeah, he led me to you, and he said you might be able to help me with this project. He says, as far as I know, Inman says, what is he doing now? And Inman says, Auschler says, well, as far as I know, he's working in the background on things. He's extensively working with Timothy Good in a publication he has put out above top secret, which you may or may not be aware of, out of William Morrow in New York. Inman says, uh-huh. Then Exler says, okay, in any case, he's working. They are more or less working together. Timothy Good is a consultant, and And he's saying Admiral Lord Hill Norton is, the way he's expressed to me, quite furious with the inability to gain knowledge on the issue around UFOs. Inman acknowledges it. Then Exler says, he's in fact sent Timothy Good here on a tour, hoping to find more information. There was a conference in Las Vegas at the end of June, the first couple of days in July, and he goes on about this conference, etc. And Inman says, what is the general area of interest? And Exler says two things. It's my feeling in my research that there's some kind of dichotomy of sorts, one in which there seems to be an indoctrination program to educate the public the realities that are involved here. The other must be a problem relating to security measures and the need to know level. I have the ability to control the influence and understand the acceptability of a great mass of the public. And he goes on to talk about how he has TV and radio exposure and stuff. This is Exler talking to Inman privately, but he's recording it. Inman says, all of the areas that you're discussing, they're all vastly out of date for me, relating to the fact that he hasn't been now CIA director for 8 years. When I made the decision to retire 7 years ago, I made a conscious decision to sever ongoing ties with the U.S. intelligence community. I may have some exposure on limited occasion. And Exler says, right. And he says, well, I didn't want to step on any toes. I'm trying to get to the right people, etc. So Exler says, is it your understanding that there's a cultural dialogue going on? And Inman says, well, I guess I have to ask, with whom? Between which parties? And Exler says, well, between any of the parties that are presently behind the technology inside the craft. I don't know. I haven't a clue whether there are any ongoing dialogues or not. I'm trying to think who there in Washington would be much closer to the issues that might be able to at least give you guidance on it. Exler says, that's what I'm looking for. And then Inman says, the deputy director for science and technology in CIA is named Everett Hindman. He is in fact getting ready to retire in the very near future. They make him somewhat more willing to have dialogues than he otherwise would have been. And he goes on to say, this guy will give you basically the inside track you're looking for on the UFO file. And then he also mentions that Sumner Shapiro has been a vice president of BDM, and he just retired. He'd be a good person to go to. And then Exler says, what's BDM? Now, BDM is what we just showed you the logo for. They're the UFO redevelopment company, and he's recommending him right here. And Exler says, do you anticipate that any of the recovered vehicles will become available for technological research outside of military circles? And Inman says, BDM is a corporation there in the McLean area. His level, that is Sumner Shapiro, who is another major Navy admiral, his level of integrity is very high. 10 years ago, the answer would have been no about your question there, about if the crafts are going to become available for technological research to the public. Whether the time has evolved that they are beginning to become more open to it, there's a possibility. Again, Mr. Hindman would probably be the best person to put the question to. And then they mention a few other niceties and so on. So Inman is taking him in terms of the craft that we've recovered. This is what happened. Now, later, you have the big denials from Inman, but he was recorded and all the rest of it. And so he will go on to say, well, I did investigate UFOs at NSA and at the CIA, but, basically, I think they were just black projects inside the government, and I can't talk about it. But he was working with these groups, just like he's mentioning BDM there. Now, it's fascinating because these were the groups that were at the heart of redeveloping the UFO file. Interestingly enough, it will be Exler who will go on the record and say, from my first meeting with Inman to the phone call and everything else, I understood he gave me great confidence in the fact that the UFO file was being actively developed. So that's where he was coming from on the whole thing. And that's been a part of the lore of it. But here's the thing in the figure of Inman, which is Inman came out of these programs. He came out of the very heart of the secrecy, and he worked, and on the record has admitted to studying the UFO file in relation there. And he's also giving hints here to Exler about where to go to get information for studying the UFO crafts for redevelopment. Now he'll have to back off dramatically from that. And then a couple of years later, he's going to be put up as Secretary of Defense for Clinton. And he has an incredible pushback, as I've mentioned. I think that that whole piece is related, which has kept him off of the entire topic. He was approached a couple of years ago, and somebody, came to him and asked him about the UFO file again, and he would not budge an inch on it. This guy, who has all the knowledge of being MJ4 and working in the redevelopment program, all the inside knowledge around the Kennedy thing, and who gave the award to George Joannides, is the key figure for the task force, which is studying both the assassination, deep state assassination of President Kennedy, and the CIA figures involved, like Joannides, and the UFO file. Inman is your obvious, clear choice for the whole thing. And it might be also a case where he wants to put things on the record. So, but if he doesn't, I think you could subpoena him to, ask him the questions, and we could get answers that way, one way or another.
It sounds like he actually would like to testify if he wanted some disclosure.
I think, yeah, he's in a position to do it. He's lived, a very full life, a very distinguished career, and all the rest of it. He's been on the ins and outs of all this, but he understands secrecy very well. So, nonetheless, he can be, I think, on the congressional side, compelled to give testimony about Joannides. And, I think that that's something, now that the Joannides file has come out that said Joannides was behind setting up Oswald and you gave him the medal, that should be something that he needs to come into the public arena and address. And this is a guy, again, who, you can look at him from a few different ways. He kept the secrecy, he kept the proprietary secrecy, but he also got out of the government because he thought that the intelligence agencies and the covert operations on the CIA side were too sketchy. So, you're looking at somebody who walks that line right between X-Protect and X-Share on that. And that's why I think he's crucial. With that, Miss Olivia, I have a ton more to go through, but
I know you use so many printouts.
I'm going to throw it over to you.
Okay, so Joseph said Inman was, just reminding us, supposedly at the Secret Space Program conference in Bastrop. He says, I suspect because Dr. Brandenburg was doing a presentation there.
Yeah, and Dr. Brandenburg's whole presentation was about a nuclear event on Mars, which makes, tremendous sense that somebody, in the area, that he would come out to do that. I would also say this about Brandenburg's work is, it's very advanced in that sense, which is he's taken some very logical steps on a scientific level. And I spoke to him there at the conference, and his presentation was dynamic, incredibly dynamic. I think that there's something to the idea that there was a civilization there. And this goes into a lot of deep levels of how to look at that. But nonetheless, I think it's really worthwhile to think about Brandenburg in relation to that. And Inman, again, is right in Austin. And, he's in his 90s, but he's still working. These people are very, very impressive. And Professor Scott's like that too, over there in Berkeley. He's still working in his 90s. But I would say this about Inman, that this is not, it's not a witch hunt or something to get somebody to go on the record. It's literally, look, a lot of the UFO wall of secrecy has fallen because the CIA has tried to put up a false UFO threat. This is the time that you can put things on the record. Now, you are under secrecy vows. Yeah, we understand that. However, you on the record gave a medal to George Joannides, who is now exposed as somebody who was setting up the patsy, and the assassination of President Kennedy. And you also, we're doing a UFO committee about UFO transparency, and you've been at the very heart of that. Everyone knows it, you know? I mean, John Warner put it on the record in our interview. I mean, it's not even a question anymore. We know that you were involved and expecting. You might have even been a positive force for UFO disclosure. So it's a crucial aspect of what they're doing with the records release and all the rest of it, that you draw that in. And if you don't, drawing it in through a figure like Inman makes sense from a number of different levels. So if the committee comes back in with Luna and they ignore the Inman connection with Joannides, it's not a functional committee. It's just something where they're set up as puppets to bring forward some kind of Cuban mafia thing where they can shuttle off the Kennedy assassination and the responsibility by the ex-protect intelligence groups that did it, and kind of move it on to Sam Giancana, and remember in the testimony I read, and I appreciate that we went deep in his own testimony with his own words, that he starts talking about Judith Exner. And Judith Exner, through Cy Hirsch, gives this whole piece that I've laid out so crucially about what Kennedy was doing with his human intelligence network. Kennedy's getting around he does the same thing when he communicates with Khrushchev. This is a very important network he develops. It doesn't require, and it doesn't go through any kind of surveillance channel. Nobody can get at it because he's giving it to a person. That person's giving it to another person and then giving it back, and he's getting it. The only time that she opened up the envelopes, she describes them quite graphically as advanced aerospace blueprints. This is what Kennedy was doing with that organized crime piece. So when you there on the disclosure committees are looking into this, what you need to do is open all the FBI observation files on Judith Exner, of which there are 4 years worth. I don't even know if the CIA was looking at Judith Exner. I bet they were. The FBI was exploring all these connections around Judith Exner in that period, and they were watching her house, and they got it broken into. And who was it broken into by? The twin sons of the CEO of General Dynamics. Yeah. And the FBI didn't do anything about it. They wanted to know what was going on there. Marilyn Monroe died a few days after that. I mean, these things leapfrog through history, and it's very interesting. The FBI agent noted nothing was taken. Like, the jewelry that was there was still there. There was money there. Nothing was taken. Well, something was maybe placed. Maybe they picked up their tape machine. Maybe they grabbed their bugs or whatever. But there's a huge piece there in that General Dynamics contract for an experimental fighter aircraft that becomes the foundation and is developed at Pine Gap, in fact, in the late 60s, which is the Australian version of Area 51. So if you're going to go to the heart of what was going on, you have to go into the UFO file, and you have to go into the aerospace piece around the JFK assassination. And interestingly enough, Inman, he has the lock with Joannides because he gave him the medal. So you have an interesting window opened up in history there. If they miss that, if they don't do anything about it, this is why I'm putting it on the record. This is something that this show has been very good about. And I think in some ways, like when we were looking earlier at the picture being used by Cuomo and Luna, it's directly from this show. These people are very aware of what comes through this show. Now I'm telling them, if that committee is real and serious, Inman is where you would go. Yes.
Joseph also says Inman has enough cachet that many people would believe him over other whistleblowers if he came out and said something.
Absolutely. He could be, well, I mean, he definitely, I'm not naive to the fact that he's so wedded for a whole life of secrecy that he will give us those valuable pieces. But the thing is, he has an excuse to go on the record if they call him forward under the Joannides situation. And as a patriot, he could respond and say, yeah, this is true and that's true. I mean, he said that thing about Schlesinger, and as I said, there's no proof that Schlesinger had evidence of Kennedy trying to assassinate Castro. And, this isn't a light thing. And it's like, well, Kennedy tried to assassinate Castro 60 years ago and all the rest of it. No, this is what they want to make you believe. Remember, they forged cables of Kennedy assassinating the DM brothers. And E. Howard Hunt had to admit to the Watergate Committee that they did that. So, they're totally willing to lie to you about the past and the background of the past. And it's not important when we're looking at it from a foreign policy aspect, just from that perspective. But when you see the piece of it through history, when you see what's going on in relation to why they were involved in relation to this piece around Giancana, why they were getting blueprints from defense contractors about advanced aerospace craft, it takes you on a totally different place. You start to understand, the secrecy was working. Kennedy was penetrating the secrecy through the assets that he had, human intelligence network, and they would interact with the mafia to get information about the defense contractors. That's the interesting thing there. As a matter of fact, I took all of the exchanges with Giancana as him getting information about what the CIA was offering the mafia to kill a foreign leader. This is very important because an executive action program, the assassination program inside the Central Intelligence Agency, is still active. So it would be nice if we were talking about an archaic form of, deep state intelligence and how the intelligence agencies used to operate. I'm sorry, but, we just had the anniversary of the President Trump assassination attempt from last July, which almost succeeded by that much, and we don't know anything about the assassin. There's no explanation for his motivation, nothing. They turned him into, they cremated him into ashes so fast that we can't do anything about it. We don't even know if that was him. So, you're in a place where the intelligence agencies run the situation and they run the media. And then you can say, well, you have the independent media. Well, so much of the independent media now is bought or is superficial that it's not potent. So there could be a potent thing that comes out of it. There's the ability to forge a third way in all this. But as it stands, it would be very easy for an intelligence community to dominate the entire thing. Yes.
Okay, David Donaway, was Inman working on setting up cybernetic automated tracking systems and possible weapons for above and below surface movements of unidentified vehicles?
Well, he says a very interesting thing, which is he says, when he's talking about, he always gives out hints when speaking about the projects that he's working on that you can extrapolate out into his work in the UFO field. So, for example, when he talks about developing AI stuff in secret to make sure the other guy doesn't get ahead of you, and also to pursue the various national security aspects involved, he's talking about the UFO file. He takes the same approach to it. If you just apply his standards for that and bring it over into the UFO file, the whole thing makes sense about his career. Look, it's very interesting. In the early 90s, there's a couple of different books that come out by journalists who aren't associated with the long-term history of the UFO file. They're just doing kind of ad hoc books. And they have NSA whistleblowers in there talking about a group inside the NSA that's studying the UFO file. I'm going to read a quote from one of these books, and it's the Out There book, which I think is the only book that Howard Bloom wrote about this. And it's very interesting because it's Cy Hirsch who gives him the information that there's a UFO group inside of the NSA. And it's very interesting. The whistleblower in here sounds a damn lot like Inman. But I'll just read a couple of quick things. And at first, when he mentions UFOs to Seymour Hirsch, who's done all these expose books on the CIA, and then embraces the CIA to get all this dirt on Kennedy for the Dark Side of Camelot. They wanted the book that would take Kennedy down. Yes, Kennedy was doing all this stuff. He had all these mistresses. He was, all this kind of stuff. And Hirsch was taking it hook, line, and sinker so that the CIA looked like heroes in that book, and Kennedy looks terrible, right? That was the whole point of the thing. And so he failed dramatically on that and took the hook from the CIA saying, hey, we're going to give you this intel about it. And like I said, some powerful things got out in there anyway. But so he approaches, this Bloom guy approaches Hirsch and he says, I'm going to, I need some help on this with the UFO thing. And he says, Hirsch flips out and says, don't ever ask me about that and all the rest of it. And then calls him up very quietly later and says, after these tirades and things, he says, okay, there is, the government is just what you're thinking about it. They do have a committee inside of NSA that's looking at all of this. So after, I don't know, playing, maybe he knew he was under surveillance and needed to say it. He comes back and he says to Bloom, no, the NSA does have a UFO group. And then Bloom says, can you give me a name, someone I can talk to? And then Hirsch says, you think I'm going to risk that for you? There's a story there. Isn't that enough for you? Find it yourself. And he hangs up. Weird behavior. They're friends. So I started, and he's going around to these different things. Department of Defense spokesman took all this time and said no. The CIA said no. NSA, etc. And they were very terse with him. And what happens is someone learns that he is in fact doing this, and he says, I'm willing to give you some information about this UFO working group. And he's someone who was at NSA and isn't anymore and thinks they're absolutely reckless with the UFO file. I've wondered if that wasn't Inman that this guy was talking to in relation there. But then again, the NSA comes up. Now, of interest, earlier this year, the FBI, when everyone was being fired, says, you know what? We're afraid here inside of the FBI that we're going to get axed. We are part of a UAP working group. No one had ever heard of a UAP working group inside of the FBI. Of course, if you've tracked the UFO file the way that we have, you find things about the UFO file and the FBI going all the way back to the 1940s. Our friend Bannister was running the UFO file for the FBI, but you never hear about a UFO working group now. So they go on record and say, we're afraid these agents that, Trump is going to, as some kind of punishment, retribution for J6 and all that kind of stuff, that our program is going to get squelched. So they put up this whole thing about how we're the UAP working. This is very strange. Nobody's ever heard of that. I don't know what's happened to them since they surfaced and said this so they could keep their jobs. But the same language is being used. The working group part, that also is in Bloom's book. So I find that very, very interesting. Yes, Miss Olivia.
George Ivankovich wants to know, what did Forstall tell Kennedy? And also, don't forget Bohemian Grove is going on right now.
Well, that's true. Well, they're sharing, deep, deep aspects on this. Forstall, we've done 2 documentaries that have included him, and JFK, The Final Speech, has most of what you're looking for in there. But what I would say about Forstall is this, that he was close to Kennedy. He was close to the family. He took him of a tour of post-war Berlin when he was becoming the Secretary of Defense, and Kennedy wasn't even in office. He was a journalist, in fact. And he does this great article about it, including the fact that he doesn't think Hitler's dead because the Russians are all saying that he's not. So Kennedy has a real insight there. But Forstall becomes aware of the whole UFO aspect, and then he shares that with JFK, and JFK, being a family friend and all the rest of it, when he's thrown out very unceremoniously out a window in Bethesda Naval Hospital, just a year into being Secretary of Defense, after this incredibly illustrious career working for the government, Kennedy, Kennedy must have been very aware of what was going there with Forrestal. And of course, you know, sets up this photo session of visiting his grave during his own presidency. There's so much that Forrestal was aware of that I think the problem there again is he's an ex-share guy, and Forrestal wanted to share the UFO file with the public. He didn't think it was something that was sustainable, and the forces inside of the Truman administration at that time were looking at him and saying, he's going to, we're going to use this guy as the Secretary of Defense, and he wants to give up the UFO secret. So, suddenly he starts having mental trouble, right? He's depressed all the time out of nowhere, and he gets checked into Bethesda, and then they throw him out the window. Very interesting. One thing I uncovered, which I've never heard anyone uncover anywhere, and we put it on the record in the show. I would love more information about this, but Hemingway knew Forrestal. And there's a story by a journalist talking about when he was a 12-year-old boy, he met Hemingway in a cafe. And they're looking at the newspaper. And the newspaper is all about, Forrestal getting thrown out a window at Bethesda. And Hemingway points it to him and he says, "Do you think that headline is real?" And the kid is just a 12-year-old kid. He's like, "Oh, yeah, it's terrible, And Hemingway says, "No, did you know they found glass in his bed?" Says, that's not, if he jumped out the window, that's not going to happen. So something had already happened. They had already, gone through, broken the window, and struggled with him in the bed and then threw him.
Wow.
So that's Hemingway. That was his take on Forrestal's death. So take that to school. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, more questions coming at you. This is X Series 200, the Inman UFO file. Obviously, these pieces and parts form a kind of a moving diagram in the X Series. And there's so much about Inman and the Joannides aspect. And I haven't laid very heavily into the JFK part because I've done that so much in talking about Joannides. What I was trying to get at with this is that experimental technology part and the role in secrecy that it plays. And it's not being blind to the idea that as a country you need secrecy around certain things. It's that the secrecy and the wall of secrecy has become so out of hand that there's a schizophrenic nature of relationship between the leadership up here operating with this very high technology, this X-tech world that they live in. And then we, on the regular surface of things, the average person not knowing anything about that and now being fed disinformation about a UFO threat. Remember, the UFO file is real. There are UFOs. There's no question about it. They may be off planet. Quite possible. They may be an advanced group here. Whatever it is, it's something that's outside of the realm of our public reality. And these guys on the government side have been aware of it and tracking it. And I've always said, it's not that you're going to get real disclosure from the government, but forcing answers from the government around the subject is a crucial exercise. It's a crucial effort. And the things you can get in relation to that. I mean, look what we've been able to open up. It took 60 years of JFK researchers putting the truth before the public. And now the official record has to agree with them that the CIA knew all about Oswald. The next step is the CIA did the assassination and blamed Oswald. You see? So, that's 60 years to unwind one gigantic op of killing a president. What is involved with that? You're 24 years out of 9/11. What were the changes, from these deep events that get brought into society? These are the questions, the crucial questions. And the UFO file is in the heart of it because it relates to that advanced technology. That's the point. And if you want to say, look, I'm just going to be honest with you. There's too much evidence in relation to aliens that, it's too much to just say, oh, it's just a government experimental project of advanced crime. That's ridiculous at this point. There's something else operating there. with full technology and all the rest of it. So it's not just a government program. No. No, there's certainly a UFO file and a UFO reality, but the UFO threat aspect that they live on right now and that these counterintelligence agents are trying to sell the American public on, that's the thing. And I hear, I'm sorry, but the general state of independent media around the UFO file is infantile. Ridiculous. They're like, oh yeah, man, I can't wait until Elizondo comes back and, really does it up. And they're just nuts. They haven't looked into it. It's like some kind of sports game to them or something. And, the evidence is clear that the counterintelligence people are lying. And the DOD billionaires that are behind them were giving you the reasons why they're for the lies. So that's the track that we need to be on. And I would like to see a much improved alternative media on this. And I don't think the pop click stuff helps. There's always going to be some of that, but it's dominating right now. So that's a problem. Okay, a couple more questions and we're done.
Okay.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journal. This is X Series 200, deep, the Inman file. Bobby Ray Inman, the enigma of the century. UFO file, CIA Joannides PSYOP revealed. This is it. You are at the heart of it all. And in the middle of it, the strange Rockwell Bimini, connection. Whoa. I mean, yeah. Give me some of that.
Guai Lu says, DJ answering questions before I can ask them. Great work. And Austin Temple
Okay.
says, dark journalists should be the new golden age of PBS.
Can you imagine? Well, something weird is happening now. I mean, they're using my stuff in the Washington Post. This is crazy. Look, it's better than Michael Jackson's glove. It's an AI glove. Go for it.
Okay, so David Donaway says, Leiter and Serco both help run Earth surveillance from Maui, Greenland, Diego Garcia, and I suspect Pine Gap. Remember, Pine Gap is helping Israel and U.S. in the targeting of Gaza, along with Palantir, Alex Karp, and Peter Thiel. Netanyahu suggested Israel is, quote, the second eye and the six eyes, unquote, via Unit 8200. Does this mean there is an ironclad alliance at the X-Tech level?
Well, there's a version of tech, like an MIT version over there in Israel. And some of the things that have come through about the advancements they've made in space is extraordinary. It's interesting. I've looked into the Cuban space program. Yes, Cuba has a space program. There's something very unusual in relation to this, which is everybody seems to come under this umbrella of not, if you're going to operate up there, you can't say anything about the UFO file. Now, Musk, for example, with SpaceX and everything that he's done, he still maintains that there's no UFOs up there. He has the largest library of anything except for NASA and the government. He has the largest library of video, photography, witness, and interaction. I mean, forget it. As for SpaceX, they have all access to that. The fact that he can say that with a straight face is remarkable.
It kind of reminds me of Thomas Crown. For some reason, I just, I just imagine him. He is an infant, like we know emotionally. That must be this glee, this kind of boyish glee, a little giggling over hoarding of the UFO tech.
Yes.
Any little pictures that he gets or a tour through this or that. It's there's so much joy in keeping it to oneself. For a certain personality type.
Oh, there's no question about it. I'd say with Musk we have a problem, and his going after Trump really showed a lot, I think, about who he was. And I think that that kind of public betrayal type thing. And then also, I'm going to set up a new party. I've put it on record before that I think his goal is to be a space president. And nobody, this is going to be a crucial thing in the future that they're gearing up for. And I do think that what they've done with Twitter and X initially getting it out of that liberal, fascist, um, all the incredible censorship that was going on. Forget it. But might be that it's going to be used to set up this America Party thing. And I can already see, my kind of third eye version of this is they're already going back. The Musk types are going behind the scenes and talking to the Tucker Carlsons and other people and being like, get on board with this now. You'll be the guy. Because I still think that, somebody like Tucker Carlson is kind of logical. And when he made comments after the Epstein thing came up, and Trump didn't really have a chance to answer at that point. And I think, Trump stumbled eventually when he came around to discussing that a couple of times. But the fact is that the Trump administration prosecuted the Epstein case in 2019. So, and then this whole thing about the Wall Street Journal being like, oh, look, Trump drew like a cartoon of a naked woman and it's for Epstein. I mean, this is strange. This is very strange. And I think it's Musk who's generating. I really do. And I think that that should be called out as well, because he was doing this a month or two before this even came up. So, but Carlson suddenly said, I think there should be I'm not in favor of revolution, but it's that kind of a statement about Epstein that should cause a revolution. What, bigger than like the Fauci stuff and all that? No. I mean, what are you talking about? So that was weird. And I have a feeling that Elon is trying to move Tucker into this like revolutionary party thing or whatever. Keep an eye on it. Mark my words, as we say.
Well, it doesn't feel like independent.
It's odd, isn't it?
It's, well,
And for him,
he's under some kind of new orders.
yes, 100%. Couple of quick things. When Inman left, just to round out Inman, when he left this MCC company, which was part of Rockwell and all the rest of it, and had all these AI people in the late 80s, there was a big thing about why Inman left and all the rest. And here's something very interesting to note. Inman plans to become chairman of Westmark Systems, which is a new Texas-based private holding company established to purchase defense industry electronic firms. Controlled by Mason Best Company, the merchant banking firm started by former Interfirst Bank chairman Elvis Mason and Houston entrepreneur Randy Best. Westmark will seek to acquire companies that will develop leading-edge technology, according to Inman. The board of the privately held corporation Inman will run reflects the powerful circles in which it travels. Transportation Secretary Drew Lewis, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And that's when Rumsfeld was setting up COG. Former Democratic National Committee Chairman Robert Strauss. So, this is the thing about Inman, where the move then into SAIC and then finally for Blackwater, X. It's literally was called XE. He was moving into these positions, deeper and deeper government, like the kind of contracting agencies that are super secret. But SAIC represents that dabble directly. They looked at him and said, you can help us because of your expertise in the UFO field. So the entire SAIC, which is very, very unusual organization, secret technology development, hardcore. When you're looking at that and you're seeing his connections, this is somebody who, is playing the black projects card, and they know where to go for someone who'll keep those secrets. On the private side, he was the natural choice. And I think that he became disgusted with public life. I was like, make plenty of money with my expertise in these highly sensitive, privatized UFO X-Tech companies. The other groups that were working with him when he was doing MMC, including Rockwell, also Sperry was in there. That'll ring some bells, and Hughes Aircraft. So, yeah. And with the skill, this is the final article I'll quote from. With the skill and savvy that once made him Washington's consummate high technocrat, retired Admiral Bobby Ray Inman has turned his talents from the classified to the proprietary. This is crucial. He's the model for it. The man who managed this country's most sophisticated national security technologies, the NSA from 77 to 81 and the CIA, has glided smoothly to the private sector, where he now bids to become the unofficial U.S. ambassador of innovation, or the ambassador to the UFO file innovation, which had been privatized. That's really what they're getting at there. I didn't go into the thing about Sumner Shapiro. I just want to say this briefly. It was another Navy enigma that he was. It's a really weird story, but Exler was recommended by Inman to talk to him because he was retiring, and Exler goes there, and apparently Inman hasn't called him back, and he hasn't referred to this guy. But because Exler came in with such a convincing, like, oh yeah, I talked to Inman, this is what we talked about, and he said to come to you and all the rest, that Sumner says, well, yeah, okay, I'll talk with you and I'll go deep with you. And he gets excited about talking about the UFO file, and even talks about some of the craft that he's been involved with recovering. And he says, it's the damnedest thing about all this. No one ever talks about it, but these things come apart like Chinese boxes. This is what we realized. We could take this part and bring it on a truck, and then take this other part on a truck, and then they just all fit back together again. It was the most incredible design in the world. And they're having this great time talking, Exler and Hero. So this ends a little bit differently, though. So at a certain point, Exler's like, oh, I'm excited about this. I want to show you some things that we've come across in our research, and have you take a look at them. And Sumner Shapiro was like, yeah, great, okay. And so Exler takes out this picture of what is like a gray head, and he's like, this is a picture. One of our sources says that this is an actual gray that they're going to do an autopsy on. And the guy, his whole demeanor changes. He says, who are you? What do you mean? What did you mean about Inman? And he tries to call Inman to be like, is this guy legitimate? And then he's like, I can't have any more communication with you any further. Get out, basically. And he never talks to him again, after being this incredibly open, like, hey, you won't believe it, but these craft fit together and all this stuff happens. The alien head blew the deal, and Exler lost his whole connection with the guy. Whatever it was about the gray head, there's a few things there. One is, it might be the ultimate untouchable to talk about the bodies, or if someone approaches you with that, that it's a disinformation piece, and so you instantly become suspicious. Whatever it was, this Navy admiral who was the recommendation by Inman for Exler to go to sea, he flipped it and became so paranoid that Exler got freaked out and had to get out of there. So I guess the lesson is, if you're trying to get intel from these guys, don't show them the gray head with the big eyes. Okay, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 200, the Inman UFO file. CIA Joannides PSYOP revealed. We revealed some of that PSYOP here tonight for you, and I think we went to the heart of the matter with the whole thing. We'll take your last question.
I don't have a great last question except this.
That's okay.
D. Hayes says, how optimistic are you about us getting our UFO files, the pre-Kennedy era files, and about to 1980?
No, I think anything pertinent is in a secret, private hands of the X-Protect group, which operates between intelligence and private aerospace and government aerospace contractors, defense contractors. So I don't think there's any chance of getting it. What I do think you can get is enough details around it so that the good researchers can figure out where things have gone to. Now, remember, Barry Goldwater famously approached Curtis LeMay over at Wright-Patterson. And Curtis LeMay, his friend, said, if you ever ask me that question again, I'll never speak to you. Why? He said, what about the blue room at Wright-Patterson? But what he meant was the blue UFO file, which is the heart of the whole thing. By the way, during the course of the X series, we identified the blue UFO program and, the whole background of how it came to be and all the rest. And that's what they used. And then a year later, after we did the program, they revealed, okay, yeah, there is a blue program. And but it was a crash retrieval program, but we never found anything to retrieve. So, so much for that. By the way, we called it Kona Blue. Um, and so I got the name, and then I got the to decipher what Kona was all about, which was Kingman, Ossining, Nellis, and Aztec, which were the 4 major crash retrievals that have actually taken place. That's what Kona Blue meant. And that was another opening on that blue thing. While I was doing that, a bunch of those counter intel people that you saw on your screen in Congress and stuff saying, I'm part of a UFO disclosure thing, were getting in touch with me and being like, hey, how are you? Your work, I enjoy your work so much. By the way, how'd you find out about that blue name? And it was like a weird thing that kept getting slipped into the conversation. They all knew it because they all know that the name of the program is blue. So did I, so it was a weird thing. Here's what's interesting. The Wall Street Journal, and part of this fissure that's been going on in that false CIA UFO threat world with Mellon and Elizondo and all their influence, something else is trying to push that off and get back to like a secrecy thing without risking the UFO threat part. And what happened was they wrote this article, a 2-part article. It was very uninformed. And they talked with, the Black Vault guy, and they didn't share any of his responses on this, which was weird. But the other people they kept in there. And it was like, there is no UFO file. It was just, the government doing advanced stuff and pretending they put out cover stories about aliens to cover up what they were doing, right? And you can see how that works in 1 or 2 cases, but it doesn't work for the broad subject. I'm sorry, millions of people having encounters, and that's all just a government op. So that doesn't fly. But they kept pushing this, and they started to push out the whole the whole Mel and Elizondo thing. They were like, these were just cover-ups for, these programs, these advanced programs. And then they started to say that the nuclear thing, how UFOs are attracted to nukes, were just, this is more of the same. This is the government trying to test their own nuclear people to see if they're up to. This has happened all over the world. So that didn't fly. That was weird. So now you're seeing in the middle of that article, they say there's a hazing program. That's why all these whistleblowers think there's a real UFO file. You know what that hazing program is called? Yankee Blue. And all that hazing Yankee Blue program does is they show them false videos of UFOs and say there's UFOs out there and you are now on the secrecy track. And so when they come out and they say, I've seen UFO videos, they're Yankee Blue. So Wall Street Journal was trying to do this with a straight face. But again, the Yankee Blue was the name of the program. Yankee Blue is a real name of a real program in there. And the source just misidentified its entire meaning, so the Wall Street Journal would never get near it. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about blue. There's more about blue that's going to come off. But I will say this. Do you remember when Michael Schellenberger and all Elizondo and all these people came before Congress and said, I know the name of that program. It's Immaculate Constellation. Nothing ever came out about that. It was a total joke.
They dumped it.
They dumped it. They got whitewashed. Some weird intel person whitewashed them. That became the congressional hearing, Immaculate Constellation. The blue thing, forget it. They came out with some denials or whatever.
It's a misdirect.
Yeah. And remember this on the record. Okay. We came out with March 2023. I revealed the blue UFO program. And that thing, they had to admit it a year later, because I'm sure once I got it out, once the counterintelligence people were starting to tune in on that and trying to figure out where I had heard it from, obviously they were like, well, we have to have some kind of explanation for this thing. And so they let out the Kona Blue thing. So it's very interesting. You see how that program works. They they keep a lid on it. There's a way to keep a lid on it. And part of that keeping a lid on it was the Yankee Blue explanation of the Wall Street Journal. Now, on the one hand, the good thing was that it made, some good points about people like Mellon and Elizondo being deceptive. But remember, those are CIA people that are coming in to push a threat narrative funded by billionaire Mellon. Mellon. So, we have to think about that. Like that's what their job is. But that's a false UFO threat. That piece is false. That's the CIA talking point. The UFO file's real. The CIA UFO file talking point isn't. That is the crucial mental delineation to take. That's the position to take. So that's my kind of roundabout thinking of the whole thing. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done this evening. X-200.
Right. Great job.
Nicely done.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Cody G, who gave us a very generous super chat tonight.
Fantastic.
Okay. I'd also like to thank Descat Brock, Eurythmia's Fun, Jay Parsons, Jonathan McIntosh, Christo, Thomas Ball, Terry Doherty, Debbie McAdoo, Tommy Van Gumpel, Audra Warless, Jennifer Walters, and Rich Hall. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Incredible. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We couldn't do the work that we do without you. And knowing that you're behind us and all the things that we are doing makes all the difference for us as well. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. And I promise to enlarge upon some things that I wasn't able to get to tonight. And some things about Sumner Shapiro's career that are kind of interesting as well. Let's see if I can say anything else about Inman. The only other thing I'll say is, I don't know if I gave the full background on MCC, but MCC was forged 2.5 years ago. They're saying this in 1986 by American high technology companies in response to government-backed programs in Europe and Japan that fostered joint research projects. It had 340 employees. All of them were scientists. Each participating company agrees to support research activities in at least one of 4 key programs: semiconductors, interconnect technology, software technology, computer-aided design of a very large-scale integrated chip. This is the company that Inman became in charge of. Inman predicted that many programs would not bear results for 8 to 10 years, although some participants already had seen side benefits, such as software usage. Most of the eventual results would benefit information processing, especially in the office, he explained. There would also be direct application to advanced defense or aerospace technology. All of the emerging technologies, telecommunications, aerospace, microelectronics, materials, energy, biotechnology, can be served by advances in information technology. The most complex of MCC's 4 programs was advanced computer architecture, Inman continued. This covers the development of parallel processing, including the flexibility of the storage and retrieval of information for improved database designs, simplifying computers for human use, and developing artificial intelligence to make computers think exactly like humans. That's 86. Who was behind the AI revolution? Well, Marvin Minsky was. We've already seen his connections. But Inman at the heart of AI in the 1980s, and what was he a specialist at? The UFO file. There's an element of that redeveloped UFO file in the artificial intelligence. Make no mistake about it. So that's the crucial thought I'll leave you with before I go tonight. Atlantis Rising is out there. There you go. Tom, Nunzi, Jennifer Walters. Have a wonderful weekend. Dr. Farrell is out there.
DJ, what was the name of episode that you did in Atlantis?
That is Maxwell and the Hot Zone.
Okay.
There's 2 of them. Let's see. Blue episode? Yeah. Well, there's blue documentaries, blue episodes. So if you go through, they're all there listed under the X series. You can find them. Don Nue, are you an alien, DJ? Don Nue is one of the smartest people in the ideas room. My goodness. I have learned more from reading this guy's posts over the years. But I have to answer the question, which is with a kind of I don't know, I would say. But I may be an unaware walk-in. But otherwise, I would think I'm as human as you are. Oh, let's see. Very intriguing, DJ. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And we're going to have Joseph back on here coming up in August. So everyone get ready for that. We're going to go deep, deep, deep. Good thing they didn't call the hazing program Confederate Gray. Indeed. Absolutely. Immaculate bust. Exactly. Immaculate constellation. Ooh-wee. Boy, was that the pits. I remember the absolute, I'm gonna say this. The absolute pits of that was Schellenberger said, I just learned the name of the secret program. If you subscribe to my X feed, I'll give it to you. I mean, that is like, I want everyone to make a living doing this, but don't do that. Don't dangle like a secret thing for your audience to buy. Terrible. I would never do that. What is wrong with that guy? Heather Sansone, thank you very much for your support. We really appreciate it. Heather's a great fan out there. Thank you for being in the ideas room with us tonight for X Series 200. It was interesting because you know how the summer is. And when I was thinking X Series 200, well, I might do this in the fall and just do a series of reports. But the Inman thing was just there. It was hanging in midair. And I was like, X200 is going to kind of like, it's going to hold the space for the summer. Let's see. Lindy T, welcome to the walk-ins. Indeed. Antisocial DJ, LOL. Hey, look, I don't claim to be an alien, but then again, I don't identify as an alien. Let's see. What else we got here? Pixie. Ask John Warner about the role of Sir Paul Mellon, known to be the secret king of Virginia, and interface with the British monarchy that must include X-Protect. Well, he's told me a great deal about Paul Mellon, including the fact that when he, got dropped in after the German war was over, they went into Edimunda, and he was standing on a craft that was a football field and a half in diameter, and it was saucer shaped. So the Germans had that. We know that. That doesn't mean all UFOs are German, but they may have found something and recovered it as well. We don't know. Whatever it is, that's pretty impressive for the record. And also, he told him that in private over drinks, with his nephew, with his grandson, rather. So, I think that's pretty significant. But wow, yeah, we'll have John back as well. He's he's been doing a lot of other stuff, but man, incredible revelations. And also remember, his books, his novels are very interesting and loaded with tons of interesting X information, shall we say. My favorite shows are Cayce and Atlantis. You have one coming up. As a matter of fact, the fall is loaded with some explosive mystery school work, and the Cayce Foundation is right in the heart of it. And there's a lot of fascinating work left on the cutting room floor with the Cayce work, because I think maybe I understand it, because it's kind of a Christian organization, and which they're esoteric Christian organization, and there's all kinds of controversial, even Atlantis is kind of controversial for certain aspects. So they've tried to be very careful about things. So they've left and kind of shelved a lot of Cayce stuff in the background. But, Cayce's bringing us the points of the Great Pyramid, reincarnation, psychic development, our past in ancient Atlantis, the many lives of Christ, So he's laying these things out, and they're all there, and they're palpable in the heart of all of the work. And so we know that there are some things to be considered there when they do it. But I've always felt that the Cayce organization is kind of afraid of his most potent work, which is the Atlantis work. And wow, what an influence. Elsid Barrett, Fubar Fighter, all hail the ideas from. I know we had some good questions out there tonight. Joseph said that is creepy and hugely significant, DJ. Which one is that, sir? I missed that. I wonder which one you're referring to. you know what that was?
I'm sorry, I lost.
Farrell said that is creepy and hugely significant, DJ.
I have no idea.
Oh, interesting. Okay, if he's still out there, let us know. Here's a little more. Let's see. Your thoughts on the 7.3 magnitude earthquake shaking Alaska's Aleutian Islands. They are known for really hardcore earthquakes, but there's that fantastic overview on the earthquake device they had been testing over there in Antarctica that Eric Hecker talked about. And that's very compelling because if you study the Tesla work, you know that he actually caused an earthquake in Manhattan, not for damage's sake, but just to kind of, prove that he could do it.
Joseph says the Inman AI connection.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Whoa. I found something else on that I wasn't able to get to tonight, but it was him discussing his vision in the 1980s for AI. And I was like, wait a minute, this sounds like you're inserting, alien thought waves in here. What's going on? And that was my take on it. But I will share that with you. And I might post that on X too, because it was just, there's so many things.
Do you have the printout over there?
Yeah, but there's so many, we'll be here for another hour looking through it. But yeah, it is. The thing is with, let's see here. Well, yeah, what I'll do is I'll find it and I'll post it because it is, to put it into perspective. I mean, some of it started to make sense. And I was like, oh my God, are they, are they moving in the redeveloped technology from the UFO file into AI? Boy, that would really make sense. And it may be, in fact, we know this whole thing about the psychic aspect around piloting the craft, which, when you hear that term psionic and all that, junk it, because that's all the disinformation track coming down the line of the government trying to sell you, who is the guy? Jake Loves the Egg guy that they try to promote on News Nation. You remember the egg love? That whole thing, and then psionic, everybody, Look, psychic interface with the UFO file is documented, and they've done practice runs trying to control those craft using psychic programs. And they've actually tried to recruit people through different various, like in grade school into high school, and to test them to see if they can do this. So it is a real program. And when you've heard people say, I was tested as a child and all the rest, these things do happen. And, I'll tell you right off the bat that I myself, when I was very young, was tested for advanced mathematical capability when I was 6. And, it was a very unusual process. So you can see when people tell me those stories, I understand them on a certain level. And I just, it's interesting to me.
Tell the full story.
No. I'll save that. Because we're at that point of the night. I can't give it the right punch, but it is. Thank you for the encouragement, though. It was a weird story, but basically, my parents got called in to give me. They wanted to give me this test because I had proven that I was above these different levels, and I was doing a grade of mathematics that was above anything in my age group, and so they were excited about it. But when they got there, there was a guy there who wanted to do a whole program with me, but they wouldn't identify really what he was. So the school was like, he's a liaison with us. And then my parents very quickly figured out that he was a government person. And once they did a little further dig on him, they realized that, the reason he wasn't telling them was he wasn't really giving them any information. He just said, oh, I represent kind of educational interest. And so it became a very, very strange situation for a little while where this guy was around, when I was a kid going to school. So it was strange. But when we get into those things, I can tell you this for a fact. They do target those kids that they think that they can use, but they might also be targeting them. I had this discussion with Gigi Young because I think it's very clear that they wanted her to be recruited into some kind of psychic program when she was very young. And this is the type of thing that they look for. When these people rise in other situations and they're not members of the government or of these groups, then they probably think, "Oh, that's the one that got away," or that's you know, and but whatever it happens to be, when I hear those stories and people come back with those stories, I'm always on the side of believing them because those things do happen. And it's funny, it gives me a chance to bring up Kurt Metzger because and Kurt's been great. He's been doing some really funny stuff. He went on some show talking about mystery schools and he came out dressed as a wizard or something. He is not only is the guy incredibly smart about the topics, but he's incredibly funny. And he had this experience when he talked about this experience when he was younger and he'd been picked out of some kind of IQ group and they had done certain things with him. He cannot remember certain aspects between certain years. I forget what he said about it, but that's a very interesting conversation. We might have to have him on to talk about this.
I'd love that.
Unbelievable. But the guy is, just a real hero and he's bringing fun back into research. So I applaud him for doing it all. Everyone, it's been so great to be here with you on this Friday, July 18th, the X Series 200 episode. Miss Olivia, bravo. And how you ever put up with 200 episodes? My God. I have to say this too, just so you know. There's 200 X Series episodes and 75 supplementary episodes. Okay. So, you have episodes supporting the X Series. So it's literally 275 episodes. And of course, we have hundreds of dark journalist show interviews as well. So, but in terms of the actual X Series where I pick it out and say, this is the episode, this is what we're doing for it. This is our 200th episode. So thank you so much to everyone for being here with us. And I'll do a last minute Charlotte Knight, George Jetson, Najat Madri. It's good to see you, Najat. Terrific. Who else do we have out there? Tim Houston. What time is it in Australia, Tim? Tell us now. All right. Jonathan McIntosh. Kurt Metzger comedy. William Aceto. Fantastic. What a guy. Everyone, thank you so much. And we will see you all next week. Have a fantastic weekend and more craziness to come with the X Series, more deep dives and so much more potency, delivering to you the real thing. Forget about the pop clickers and the imitation jobs and all the rest of it, and especially the CIA imitations of the real UFO file, the counterintelligence people. Wipe all that off. There's so many good people doing real stuff, and let's get behind them and support them. We will see you all next week.
God bless everybody.
Miss Olivia, thank you very much. And, it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
X-200 never really ends. We'll see you all next week. Have a great evening, everybody. And never let it be forgot.
Once there was a Camelot.
Once there was a Camelot, and there can be again. Remember that. Keep your fingers crossed.